Bodybuilders don't need sports science to be big. They're already big. Sports science can potentially support that. It can take sport to the next level. It can help us iron out details, but let's not pretend that athletes have needed sports science.
It's time to sit down, keep it real, and cut the bullshit. Welcome to Table Talk. All right, guys, we're back with another episode of Table Talk. My guest today is Eric Helms. Here we go, right? Senior Officer, Team 3D Muscle Journey, co-founder, The Mass Review, which I'm going to give a plug for that after I get through all this. Senior Research Fellow at Sports Performance Institute in New Zealand, Advisory Board for the Sports Nutrition Association, a co-host of the Iron Subculture podcast. Am I forgetting anything major here?
No, you're good. The big ones are, it's Iron Culture, it's Mass Research Review, it's 3D Muscle Journey, where I'm the Chief Science Officer, and then I'm a Senior Research Fellow at AUT out in New Zealand. Yeah. The
counter to that, and I have to put this out there, you're a WNBF Pro Bodybuilder. You've competed in 17 shows, bodybuilding shows, over 20 powerlifting competitions, a few Olympic weightlifting competitions, and strongman as well. So I'm going to speculate, hypothesize, I'm going to use scientific words here, that you're more meathead than you are researcher.
I think the way I like to frame it, no, I mean, you're not wrong. You're not wrong, Dave. I think the way I like to frame it is that I'm obsessed with the iron, and that includes my intellectual pursuits. So it is my way of expressing myself. It is my primary interest. You could even call it like my special interest if you think of me being a little on the spectrum, which I might be. It's something that it's the way I view the world. So I'm someone who is curious. I think I'm to some degree a quote unquote natural intellectual. I don't say that to say I'm smarter than anyone, but I'm interested in thinking deeply about things. So given that I'm a meathead through and through, what else am I going to study? I'm not going to get a law degree, Mm-hmm. So they're almost the same. Like I was very, very curious immediately upon starting to lift weights. I wanted to figure out why do things work? How do they work? How do I optimize it? So to me, it just seemed like a natural progression of being a meathead to go to study sports science and sports nutrition.
Now you started a little later, right? Because in high school it was track and field. Basketball, just general.
Yeah, really just track and field. I did play basketball, but I just wasn't good at it. But yeah, I never, I got exposure to lifting weights, which was interesting, as a part of running the 400 meter. And I did 4 years of track and field, and I played 1 year of football and hated it. So I didn't have the typical personality of someone who you'd think would get into lifting.
What about the football did you dislike?
This is funny because I ended up joining the Air Force, but I did not like the militant kind of over hyper masculinized, I'll tell you, I'll give you an experience that I think tells you. So I went to Folsom High School, which is outside of Sacramento. So I grew up in the Bay Area, and then my mom and I moved in with my uncle to get on our feet when she got some work in Sacramento, and I went to high school in a suburb. And Northern California is almost like a transplant of Texas as far as the football culture. Mm-hmm. So Folsom High School, it's a large suburb, but it's definitely a suburb, and it's a football town. And, like any other kid, I just moved into a small town from a big town. I grew up in Oakland, and I didn't know anybody. And these people, even though I came there as a freshman in high school, they had known each other for years. So when I joined my sophomore year to play football, I figured, okay, I don't know anything about football. I didn't play freshman, but this is JV. They're going to teach me. Yeah. Come to find out that the head coach had coached all the way down to Pee Wee League or Pop Warner or whatever it's called. All these kids had been in school together because it's only a one-town school at the time. So they'd been playing football together for 4 or 5 years, 90% of the team. So I felt a little bit like an outsider. And then I had this moment. I think we were playing Casa Robles, and we were in formation marching towards the field to go play. And the team captain would yell Casa, and we'd yell Killer. And I had this moment, I'm 15. I'm like, is it appropriate for me as a 15-year-old to be yelling that I'm going to kill the other team? And should we be promoting this? And I just had this feeling like, this really isn't me. And then ironically, of course, I joined the Air Force, and I joined the military out of high school. So I don't know why I anticipated that would have been a good decision, but needless to say, I didn't stay in the military, but I do have very fond memories, and it was part of my formation.
Well, I often wonder what psychological instincts make people gravitate towards individual sports.
Yeah.
So I wrestled and I played football, but wrestling, I liked that better because I was responsible for the result, my work paid off directly for what I did. In football, I could work harder than everybody else, but if they weren't and we were getting our ass kicked, it pissed me off like you can't believe.
Yeah.
Right. Plus there's that little outsider complex, like you never feel. And for me, I didn't want to be part of that crowd either. Yeah. That jock crowd or whatever, because all my friends were kind of like the opposite of that whole thing.
Right.
Were you that kind of mentality then?
Yeah, I developed socially a little late. Like I wouldn't say I really fit in high school until I was like a junior, and then things really clicked for me. But I was definitely not a jock. Like I was in a breakdancing crew, and I liked like nerdy stuff that's cool now. Like what's up with like Lord of the Rings and Marvel being cool now? That got me beat up previously, but it is what it is. So yeah, I didn't fit in with that group, and I did achieve, a popularity of a sort in high school, but through non-traditional means. And I tried to go that route. It didn't fit me at all when I played that 1 year of football. And then I kind of found my own way. And as far as what got me into individual sport, I think in many ways I relate to exactly what you're saying. Like I'm in control. If I fail, it's my failure. If I succeed, it's my success. I don't feel the pressure of other people having expectations on me that maybe I don't understand or I'm not ready for yet. And the times I had been exposed to lifting, it never fit me. It felt like part of that jock culture.
Yeah.
Until I was in the Air Force, and something relatively traumatic happened to someone very close to me at the time. And I was technically deployed, which was actually just down the hall. And that was just, on paper, I was loaned to another unit essentially.
How many years in at this point?
So this was my last year.
Okay.
So I did a 4-year enlistment. I was in the Air Force. I was a Arabic translator. Pretty cool job until you actually get to do your job. And then it's like 12-hour shifts in a windowless room, and you can't talk about it because you have a top security clearance. And it's not actually that interesting if you could talk about it, because it's mostly at the time just listening to static. If you think I was in basic training when 9/11 happened. So during the Second Iraq War, I was doing it, and I realized very quickly, like, okay, I need to do this because I don't come from a family of means to afford college, but this isn't the pathway I want to go. I thought as a young man, maybe I'd get into, government work or DOD or maybe law enforcement. It just really didn't fit me. I was kind of someone who just doesn't like being told what to do or authority or conforming. And I think I learned a lot of maturity in the Air Force, but it definitely wasn't a career path for me. And anyway, so this traumatic thing happened to someone very close to me. I felt powerless, and I couldn't even go visit them because I was technically deployed. And when you're deployed, it was for a 6-month period, and it happened right at the start, you can't take leave. So they're back in California, where I'm from. I'm out in Augusta, Georgia, where I was stationed for my only duty station I had, because I only did one enlistment. And the only outlets that were available to me that weren't unhealthy, or like self-harming, when you really think about it, was I had this good buddy of mine, a couple of good buddies of mine, one who became a long-term workout partner, the other one who showed me the ropes, who were recreational bodybuilders. And we went to the gym, and I remember my first training session. It was a leg day, because you know what? He wanted to see if I was about it. And we finished.
The way you do it.
We finished with 3x10 on deadlifts. And, it's my literal first ever serious workout. And it was like 135 on the bar. And on my third set of 10 on the last rep, I tweaked my back, and I was so out of breath that I went outside and threw up. And I was sitting there, and it enabled me to feel like I was doing something and processing this thing I couldn't control. And I was like, oh shit, this is me. This is it. I'm in. And I'm like, part of me is going, okay, you just threw up and hurt your back, and now this is what did it for you. And I'm like, I don't know. That's crazy, but this is it. And I haven't looked back since. And that was, 2004. So 21 years.
How was the training in the first year? I mean, is this Arnold Encyclopedia doing every exercise every day?
Yeah, it was literally out of Arnold Encyclopedia Bodybuilding, slightly modified based upon, big shout out to Patrick, his thoughts on bodybuilding. And yeah, we were, after I trained with him for a while, I kind of started to do my own thing and I wanted to explore. And I was basically just, anytime I felt recovered or if I wanted to train, I would train and I would do all the exercises and go past failure. I look back on it and it had a lot of passion and energy behind it and enough thought and progressive overload and those important things. And it was definitely from the start kind of what is now called power building, centralized around a lot of the compound movements. And even though I was first thinking about bodybuilding, my first competition ever was actually a push-pull meet, unsanctioned YMCA one in 2006, about 2 years and a couple months after I'd started training.
So how'd that come about?
I was a personal trainer. So after I started lifting, fell in love with it, it becomes my everything. I'm obsessing about it. And I'm like, well, what job am I going to have after I get out of the Air Force? You might think I would, take a job with the DOD or the NSA and make way more money and get more security and benefits than any 20-year-old would normally have. But I turned that down to work for minimum wage at the YMCA in Augusta, Georgia, as a fresh off the boat personal trainer who probably had no business being a personal trainer after only lifting for 2 years, but
but you knew all the Weider principles.
Well, 100%, right? And I'm telling people don't combine your carbs and fat because insulin. So I definitely I think everyone starts from a place of ignorance.
Yeah.
And if they don't, then they're either a genius or they're lying. And I am neither. I'm going to tell the truth, and I'm not a genius. So I got a lot of things wrong at the start. Fortunately, though, I wasn't experimental with my clients. I had enough humility to realize eventually that not everyone wants to be a bodybuilder. Not everyone wants to be a power lifter. Not everyone is willing to manipulate, necessary or beneficial or otherwise, their food and nutrition the same way that we were doing at the time. But it became my everything. So I started working at the Y, and I'm really glad I did not take a job in government because it would have had me go to DC. And my eventual wife, then at the time, very serious girlfriend, she still had another year in the Air Force, which is where we met. And, now we've been married almost 20 years. So yeah, that was the start of a trajectory that was very different than the trajectory I thought I would have in life when I joined the Air Force.
So from the education side, because now you're kind of split where you should be, right? Where you want to learn how to better train your clients, but maybe not because all you really care about is bodybuilding and myself with powerlifting. But then learn how to, build your physique.
Yeah.
So how are you managing that at the time?
Good question. Yeah. So
we're at this point, we're talking forums, right?
Yes.
Few websites.
Yep.
And there were libraries, so
yeah.
So where were you going?
Yeah, I was very active on the bodybuilding.com forums. And I say that before it even became like Body Space, which is kind of the second iteration. And then I did get on Facebook. But a lot of the the information I was getting was me trying to find, eventually, I would say this is maybe a year or two before I started really going into like published studies. Eventually I did start finding my way into like academic journals, PubMed. It was a little harder back then to find like the PDFs and read things like that. It was very early after I became a personal trainer that I became really interested in the physiology of sports nutrition, sports science, training, and just the science behind bodybuilding. Early on, I got exposed to Layne Norton, who is kind of like just the one generation before me. And I say a generation before me, but I mean that in terms of like the popularity of the content producer, because we're only a year different in age. And I immediately thought, oh shit, you can do that. And it's difficult to hit a target if you don't even know it exists. So sometime in 2005 or 6, I remember he had the Inside the Life of a Natural Pro Bodybuilder series. And I discovered, it's not just the IFBB. There are natural bodybuilding shows. And then in 2005 or 6 as well, I got the opportunity. I met an older bodybuilder, a gentleman, who was talking to me about the WNBF show that was local in Augusta. And I went to go be a test judge for Rodney Hilaires, who is a mid 2000s heavyweight WNBF Pro like champion. And he had a show that he put on in, I think it was Augusta or one of the surrounding towns. And I got to be on the guest judge panel because they needed more judges. And okay, you're a trainer, you've got a decent physique, you've been lifting, you're obviously a super fan. You can do a little test judge, and they compare your score to the score of everyone else. Mm-hmm. Ironically, I did perfectly on the bodybuilding. And then at the time, this was pre-bikini, pre-classic physique. And there was just the figure division, which had just come out. And the figure division, I was like 80, 70%. Mm-hmm. I was just kind of below the cutoff. So yeah, I could see how much I was kind of focused on bodybuilding. But I remember the winner. He looked like a natural Tom Platz, just incredible legs. And from that point on, I was like, oh, that's the route I want to go. And this was in the pro hormone era, and everyone is trying to convince themselves like, okay, eventually I'm going to have to do copious amounts of anabolic steroids if I want to, compete in bodybuilding, because that's just what it is. And all of a sudden I was like, oh, there's this whole other world. And then I saw Layne Norton, and that's when I was like, okay, this is it. I'm going to draw this line in the sand. I'm really interested in this, and personal training is cool. But what I would like to do is eventually I want to coach bodybuilders. And I want to coach powerlifters. That's what I want to become. That's what I want to do. I want to study that. I want to get a doctorate like Layne Norton. And I want to, give back to this sport that's given me so much and so much clarity and purpose, that I want to, produce content, and I want to do that. So that direction really hasn't changed that much, although I couldn't predict where it would take me.
Yeah. Well, the way content is delivered has changed.
Yeah.
Drastically, over that time period. What were your next steps after you realized that?
Yeah.
Right. Because more so for people that are listening, because maybe they're thinking that, and then they don't know what that next step's going to be.
Yeah.
It could be going back to school. There's a lot of, what was it for you?
Yeah. So for me, I took kind of this, multi-pronged approach. I was looking at Sacramento State, because we moved back from California after I got out of the Air Force. And I was like, all right, so do I want to pursue a degree in nutrition? And they had a dietetics program, or exercise science. And neither one was exactly the right fit. And I was just starting to find myself becoming disillusioned with personal training. I loved 80% of it, but it was the 20% of clients who, they weren't in the right phase of their motivation. They were essentially just trying to outsource a reason to work out. And I didn't want to be someone's dentist. Like, I'll come to you 3 times a week. I'm not going to brush my teeth, but if you clean my teeth, I'll do it.
That's a good analogy.
Yeah. And I look back, and there were things I could have done better. There are things I could have invested more of my thought and energy into, like, health psychology and behavior change, rather than like sets and reps and macronutrients and things like that. But so I started going to school. I completed an associate's degree at American River College, because I found I could transfer that into one of the first online programs that were there for fitness professionals at, I think it was CalU. So it's California University of Pennsylvania, which sounds ridiculous because Pennsylvania, California, but it's actually a city. Actually, we're in London, Ohio, so it doesn't sound that ridiculous, right? But so California is a city in Pennsylvania, and that school is actually quite well known for an athletic training program. And they had a partnership with NASM, National Academy of Sports Medicine, for if you were a full-time personal trainer, or at least part-time. I think you had to have a certain amount of hours. You're actively in the field, and you have the first 2 years of schooling or an associate's degree. You can get right into it and have a 2-year pathway to a bachelor's degree in fitness and wellness under the sports management, department. So I did that. I really liked it. And that was around the same time that I was trying to figure out, how am I actually going to coach bodybuilders? And this was the beginning of online coaching. There was Dr. Joe Klemczewski, and there was Layne Norton. And Joe had actually coached Layne. So there were very few models of online coaching, right? But it was becoming a thing. And on the forums on bodybuilding.com, that is where we primarily shared information. So myself and Alberto Nunez, we both had these pretty popular blogs, essentially, and occasional pictures getting uploaded. This is 2007, 8, 9. And we had a pretty large following, and we were kind of seen as young leaders in the natural bodybuilding community on a sub forum within the bodybuilding contest prep forum for all of us natties, the weirdos, right?
Are you feeling like you're not the man you're supposed to be? Low confidence, negative thoughts polluting your brain. That's me. I get it. I've been dealing with messed up hormones most of my life. A couple years I hooked up with Eric Helms, and it was one of the best things that I ever did. They're a health optimization platform that does advanced lab works and goes deeper than probably what you've ever seen before. What you'll get with Eric Helms is they have guided optimization and the self-service diagnosis. I personally have been using the guided optimization for the whole time I've been with him. Dry is my health coach. He does an amazing job. The second route that they have is the self-service diagnostics. This is just a DIY with your own health journey. You just head over to Eric Health, pick the panel, and they'll send you the report. You just kind of go from there. Either way, I highly recommend them, and you can get 10% off right now. Just head over to americhealth.com and use the code TABLETALK at checkout.
And that was going really well. We were also getting reasonably well known in the local area. Alberto and I competed in our first bodybuilding season together in 2007, and we did a bunch of powerlifting meets in 2008. This was right around the time when raw powerlifting was starting to become a thing. So I was competing in the APA, the American Powerlifting Association, run by Scott, out in kind of the West Coast, and Chip Conrad, and right in the kind of the greater Sacramento area. So we noticed just how poor the information was in that area. So we were thinking about how do we do something with this? And in the last year of my bachelor's, I had I want to say it was a sports marketing or a sports economics class. And the senior project, or the capstone project for that class, was write a business plan for something in the arena of sports and fitness. So I wrote the business plan for 3D muscle training.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And I got like cards made up, and backstage after my 2009 season, I had built some good rapport with Brad Loomis and Jeff Alberts, who eventually would become, along with Alberto Nunez, the four partners who formed 3D Muscle Journey in late 2009. And our goal initially, the model we had, which speaks to the time, we wanted to kind of create an online magazine-ish type of thing. Apparently those are just called websites now.
Yeah.
For the natural community. And it started with Jeff. He had been away from the sport for 3 years, kind of semi-retired, and decided he wanted to come back. And he came back with a focus on the process and the journey. So Jeff is, I want to say, 13 or 14 years older than me. Same with Brad. Berto and I are the same age. So we're in our early 40s. They're in their mid 50s. And at the time, we were in our mid 20s and they were in their late 30s. So the perspective they have, I now have.
That's what I was going to ask. When they're saying journey, they have that, but at 21 years old, did you really have that perspective?
I saw the value in it, but I think I was still in the process of trying to ingrain it. Because I remember saying to my wife in the car during maybe after my first season or before my first season competing in bodybuilding, and I realized as soon as it came out of my mouth, I'm like, oh, that's not good. But I said, I don't know if I would keep lifting if I didn't think I could become Mr. Natural Olympia or win the WNBF Worlds. And Barb looked at me like, really? And I was like, oh, that's not good. Because that's not the only reason I started. I loved lifting. Mm-hmm. I often think if it was, apocalypse and there's only 10 people on the planet left, I'd be like, well, okay, I need to secure the gym, and then I need to secure my food and water, I'd still be training. And it's for me at the deepest level. But there was definitely a sense of I want to be part of this community. I want to be acknowledged. And I'm also a competitive person. And the ironic thing is I just wasn't that good at powerlifting or bodybuilding, at least initially. And I think the fact that I met Jeff and that he modeled, hey, you know what, I was competing to win. It was very unfulfilling. The sport spit me up and chewed me out. And I came back at 38, focused on the journey, and I won 2 pro cards, at 38. That was it was eye-opening to me. And the other experience I had was in my very first show. I competed in a very small show. Shout out to the INBA Silver and Black Muscle Classic. It's supposedly sponsored by the Raiders. No Raiders were seen at that show. It's at a high school, but it was your typical mom and pop mid-2000s small natural bodybuilding show. Probably very similar to a small NPC show that you would have in a small town, right? Everybody knows each other. And it was a really cool experience, a lot of camaraderie. And I won the novice tall class. And then I immediately jumped into the open and I placed last. And that was a good experience because I was like, okay, there's levels to this. And then I saw the stage pictures and my posing was terrible. My color was way off. I was over oiled. So I looked yellow and shiny and not much else could be seen. And I was just so frustrated with my presentation. I'm like, I invested a lot of time and energy, thought, passion, emotion, and stress into this. And that was the outcome. So I jumped into the very next weekend, NPC Contra Costa, which is a national qualifier. Jay Cutler was the guest poser. This is 2007. He just won the Olympia. It's at Chabot College. So it was a much bigger venue, hundreds of competitors. And me, along with I think 7 other people, placed 16th, which is did not finish in the novice middleweights. But I got the pictures and I was like, that was what I wanted to do. I peaked better. I had better color. My posing was better, although plenty to learn. And I was more fulfilled by reaching something close to what I thought my potential was at that time than I was by looking at that first place novice trophy, knowing that I also placed last in the open division just 10 minutes later. And I was like, okay, so it's not just about the objective, that's a hilarious thing to say related to bodybuilding, the placing. It's not just about the squat number I put up or the bench or the deadlift, but it is about that journey. And that was in 2007. So when I met Jeff in 2009 for my next season, and I'm trying to get some of these proto thoughts going in through my mind, and in 2009, I was still hell-bent on trying to win. And I got into my first couple overalls. I placed second to an overall winner. I had a really good run, almost at getting my pro card in 2009. And Jeff was one of the people who won 2 of the shows I was in. He won the Washington State. He also won the NGA California. And I was in the overall with him and got to meet him backstage. And he interviewed me for his website called 3D Muscle Journey, which was about his blog of coming back to the sport for the quote unquote right reasons, or at least more functional reasons. And he had the natural movement. And I said, hey man, I think this could really be something. We can come together and we can subsidize all our efforts of, interviewing these natural athletes, sharing better information, bringing some science to the forefront as well. That's going to be like my role. And sharing some of these more modern practices and more holistic perspective on the sport with the California community. So we were thinking California, and we were thinking coaching as a side gig just to subsidize the fact that we're going to drive out to all these shows and powerlifting meets, interview people. I mean, this was an era where we would get in trouble for taking pictures at the venue because they were worried about it, cutting into the profits of the show photographer. And you think about that now, it's like, oh, that's free social media exposure. So it was a couple generations back, and we had to negotiate with people and make sure that we weren't trying to horn in their business. And I remember we made $400 our first year, and we were like, yeah, that covered most of our costs. That was cool. And then a couple years later, I would have never predicted that it would have become my sole and primary income that enabled me to move overseas and pursue my PhD. But that is where it got to. But in 2009, I was thinking, okay, how do we get this information out there? Well, we need a website, and we need to leverage our bodybuilding forums, vlogs that are very popular, or blogs, and kind of let people know, oh, by the way, I've got this blog article on this website. Now you follow me on the forum. So the pathway was the forums to the website. And then a couple years after that, it became, oh, now we're going to repost our blogs on Facebook, and we're going to post our competitions and our stuff on there. So that was the medium at the time. And YouTube was just kind of getting on our radar. And I think we started doing Q&As and some of the kind of raw, what people would describe as the Sam Sulek style, but it was just kind of the way people did YouTube in the 2010, 11 time.
Were you doing it for YouTube, or were you doing it to be able to have the embedded video to put on your blog?
Well, exactly, right? So YouTube was a place we could record videos and put them, and we had a channel, but then we didn't think that people would be going to YouTube to look for bodybuilding videos. We realized that maybe a year later, because this is 2010, 11.
Yeah.
But it was, okay, let's get this video, and then we can put that on our blogs. It was all very website based. And then how do we get that information out to people was Facebook and the forums. So that was the medium at the time. And then we were doing in-person seminars, and going to shows and coaching in person. I mean, the number of times I had stained dark hands from slapping Dream Tan onto people was, every weekend from April to November.
Now, at this time when you were starting out and doing the powerlifting and bodybuilding, did you have a decent grasp on periodization, that this was intentional, or was it you just love both things and you were just going to do the powerlifting in the off season, the bodybuilding, but not really understanding that you're basically running an annual plan?
I think it started as something that fit really well together, but I remember from the start, I thought that there were certain gaps in knowledge in the two communities that could be served by one another. I remember our first 3DMJ seminar, I asked the people who attended, and it was a bodybuilding seminar focused on that. I said, hey, so talk to me about what constitutes like a good leg day. And they were all variations on, I feel like I get hit by a truck. I can't walk out of the gym without stumbling. I'm sore for a week. And not a single one of them said anything about beating the logbook, better performance, getting another rep, doing another, same number of reps, but 5 pounds heavier or something like that. And at the same time as well, the narrative in powerlifting was, I remember this one relatively famous podcast, everyone basically needs to go up 2 weight classes from where they're at.
Yeah.
I'm like, whoa. And we were talking about this before we started recording. The face of powerlifting in the mid 2000s is right at the end of the peak of the West Side era. It was enhanced multiply super heavyweights. So you were doing something wrong just simply being in the 198s, like I was, right? It was like, well, you're 6 foot. You clearly should be, in the 220s at least.
Yeah.
And you're in your 20s. That's all right. You need to get up there. Not thinking, okay, I'm not necessarily built the same way as the people who are amazing at powerlifting. I am drug free. I've been bulking and bodybuilding, and we have assessed nothing about my performance. In my absolute totals going up, but no one really paid attention to Wilks or anything like that. It's because the super heavyweight mindset, if I gain weight and I put on 5 pounds on my total, then it's a win, right? But, I remember going up to the 220s and actually paying attention to my coefficient and going, I am technically less competitive now, so it was an interesting time. And because from the start, I was interested in strength and size, I don't identify as purely a bodybuilder or purely a powerlifter or even a strength athlete. I identify, right now I'm in a phase where I'm heavily focused on bodybuilding, but I see myself as like a physical culturist, and I didn't learn that term till later, but I identified as a powerlifter and a bodybuilder or a strength athlete. And I also thought they married up really well. So when we started doing these seminars with bodybuilders, it was this revolution where they learned about progressive overload, which I think was something really important to the natural community, because some of the advice that we were seemingly getting from the enhanced community was, it almost seemed like, listen, the nutrition and the thing we're not going to talk about is going to do the work, and you just kind of make sure the muscles are getting stimulated. You just train really hard, and everything's going to work out. But the powerlifters, I'm like, they're not on too dissimilar things outside of the weight room, but they're making this great progress. It's objective. They have benchmarks. They have targets. They're talking about periodization, which spoke to the intellectual in me. I loved it. So I was learning a ton about periodization. I was really interested in all the different models and the training programs. I was experimenting with Chico. I was experimenting with something I called Westside, which, probably wasn't, the kind of like the raw lifting version, the big but boring. And I remember for my test teach that got me hired at my first teaching job at Bryan University, or Bryan College at the time. It was an associate's degree program for personal trainers. I taught my test presentation was how you can have a beneficial outcome by combining hypertrophy and strength training in a phasic way for both strength and hypertrophy. And I had the rationale, I had citations, I did a good job. And this was also right around the time when Lane Norton came out with the fat training, the power hypertrophy adaptive training that he promoted, because he was also someone who started in bodybuilding, then got into powerlifting and found out that was a better fit for him. So in this era, I noticed there were several things that bodybuilders were doing that was holding them back. They didn't actually understand, what are the KPIs? Okay, progressive overload is pretty important. You need to have an appropriate rate of weight gain. You need to have an appropriate off-season body weight. And maybe if we put you in a weight class restricted sport in the off-season, and you're not just getting huge and just focusing on your body all the time, and you're not going to make the kind of gains that you can visibly see because you're natural, you're just going to get depressed and fat. Is the kind of the model we would see. And then you get to the point where you're so fat, you hate it, and then you crash diet again for the next season, and then you burn out in 3 or 4 years. So we would go, okay, your stage weight is, let's say you're 165 pounds. Why don't we compete in the 181s and maybe get up into the 198s, but we're not going to fill that class out in the off season. We have these nice objective caps. We're not doing exclusively squat, bench, deadlift periodization, but those are kind of our benchmarks. And we got some singles in there as well, but we're doing a lot of fives and kind of quote power building training. And then a lot of your accessories is bodybuilding work. You've got a community to be a part of. You've got training goals. You've got objectives. And I think that was so contrary to what was being taught in the bodybuilding community at the time, and we were also succeeding with it, that we probably went a little too far on it, and we kind of had to course correct. Once the bodybuilding community became a little more on board with the idea of progressive overload, then they asked questions like, well, why can't I apply that to an RDL? Like, why do I need to pull from the floor? Why am I doing triples? Couldn't I just get my 6 to 8 RM up on this movement? And I think that was interesting to see, because kind of I'm not claiming it like it was just us, but there was a very large movement that persisted into the 2010s even of, listen, you just add some curls and some calf raises on top of, Shaco or any powerlifting program, and it's a good bodybuilding program. Because you're getting stronger, you're getting bigger. And it's more complex than that. But at the time, I think it nudged things in the right direction, even if it wasn't 100% accurate. So I was very interested in the periodization of combining the two. And I've been doing that since the very start with myself. And we had a lot of quote unquote power builders as athletes since the very start of 3DMJ.
What was some of the pushback during that time?
You're going to get hurt. Your waist's going to get too big. Some of the old school stuff, like deadlifts, they don't really build any specific muscle. They just make you thicker. You're building tendon mass, not size. You're going to have the higher injury rates. And you need to focus on stimulating the muscle, not just moving it from point A to point B. All pretty easily refutable points. And that was kind of where it started. But then eventually it was things like, well, progressive overload doesn't require you to do squat, bench, and deadlift, and do you think that deadlift is really that good of a back builder for all of the pieces of the physique? And what else are you doing? And aren't there some movements where we do care about the mind-muscle connection or making sure it's hitting certain muscle groups, et cetera? And, how long do you think people should be focused on the powerlifting program? Like, they spend the whole offseason doing that? Or is that holding back their growth? And I'm very grateful for that pushback, because it made us have to think about it.
Did that push you deeper into the research then?
Absolutely. Yeah. So this is all happening on the backdrop of me then finishing my bachelor's, going into my master's. And then in 2011, I had my master's degree nearly finished. I got my CSCS. I got hired to teach personal trainers. I'd been a personal trainer for 6 years. And I had competed in 3 seasons. I turned pro. I got my pro qualification. I never actually competed in the PNBA, which is a smaller natural organization. And we had some very successful clients in 3DMJ. Matt Ogus popped up on the scene, who was kind of like the natty Steve Cook of the 2010s era. Big shout out to Matt Ogus, because he was, I remember not realizing the potential of YouTube until he asked me in his first client check-in. And I got a phone call from this kid, and he was like, hey, I heard good things about you guys. I didn't come into the shape the kind of way I wanted to last year when I competed in 2010. I want to compete in 2011. Can you guys help me get in bodybuilding shape? Absolutely. We met. I don't really know what he's doing on social media. And he says, hey, for my first check-in, when I send you a video of me going through the mandatory poses, because that's how we get posing feedback and check condition, do you mind if I also upload that to YouTube? And I was like, yeah, sure, man, whatever you want to do. And so he sent me the first check-in. He's going through his poses. And I'm like, yep, I'm making notes about what I want to say to him, take screenshots, things like that. And I look down, and it's got like 10,000 views. And I'm like, oh, okay. We need to consider YouTube. And things are changing. And this has happened multiple times where we've had a client who we've done right by, and they have their own platform, and it kind of created this skyrocketing effect. So we went from having a pretty good, but not quite quit your day job kind of online coaching business in early 2011 to then in early 2012, we had a 300 person waiting list because of the success Matt Ogus had. And he had his Matt Versus series. And not just that, obviously like Jeff, Berto, Brad, they had a lot of clients too, and they have had the equivalent of that over the years. We've been doing this for now 15 years. But that was one of our first big upticks, is like the Matt Ogus era. And it made us get serious. Like all of a sudden let's form an LLC. Let's get a social media platform together. Let's think about, do we need insurance? Like all of these things, like, oh, this is real. We're not just, crowdfunding like an online blog. So yeah. And this was also the point where I realized, I want to bring a sports science model to what 3DMJ does. I want to study something in the realm of strength conditioning, sports nutrition formally. And I think I can be the official chief science officer of 3DMJ to support the coaches. And this was 2011. I just got my CSCS. I'm finishing my master's. I'm building my own confidence, which I think was a big part of it. Not necessarily as an athlete, but I was getting there, right? I turned pro. I was like, okay, maybe I know what I'm doing. Maybe I have earned the right to consider myself an expert, but let's take it to the next level. And I realized I don't have to stick to Sac State or, UC Davis, or if I want to get a PhD or if I want to get, a research-based master's, because I did it all in the coursework, I have 40 online clients. I can be a digital nomad. And I was on a walk during my 2011 contest prep season, getting my steps in, trying to get lean. And I had reached out to Keith Barr, who is a researcher in muscle cell culture, hardcore muscle physiology at UC Davis, which is a 30-minute drive from our house. And I'd also reached out to AUT, Auckland University of Technology, because Brett Contreras, he did his PhD there. I knew enough of him to send him a message, and he said, yeah, I had a good experience. Living in New Zealand wasn't for me, but for 6 months I studied, and then I did my research back here. I connected with my advisor, Dr. John Cronin. And I came to a crossroads where I had this sit down with Dr. John Cronin, and he's a classic Kiwi. I showed up, you're going to meet your potential future advisor. I put on a tie. I'm getting on Skype. He starts making fun of me immediately, and doesn't he didn't all the things that I would anticipate having to ask. He was like, don't worry about that. I can tell you're passionate. If you're willing to come out to New Zealand, we'll make this work. What do you want to study? And I was like, well, I wasn't ready for that question. Yeah. I was going to recite to you all the stuff you've studied. And he's like, nah, man, I'm here for the students. So that would eventually inform my approach to being a supervisor, which I now do for master's and PhD students. But he was like, let's find a way to do what you're passionate about. And I was like, well, to be honest, I want to study powerlifters and I want to study bodybuilders. And I would love to figure out what's an appropriate protein intake for bodybuilders while dieting. And he's like, well, let's do it. I'm going to hook you up with Karen Zinn. She's a registered dietitian and a sports nutritionist. I can link you up with a protein researcher who's down in the South Island of New Zealand. Come out here with Barbara. I can get you teaching some of my classes. We'll make it work. You've got your online job and good to go. So I was on this walk with Barbara and I said, so we can pack up our whole house, sell our cars, take our 2 cats and ship them off to New Zealand with us and go to Lord of the Rings land. Or I can just have a longer commute and we can stay with this community we've built. 3D Muscle Journey was known. The Sacramento area was big at this time. And it's right around the same time as super training was popping off. It felt like a risky proposition for me to move away from this thing that we had built, even though I knew we were mostly online more than being based in California. That was a change, right? This is right around the time where people were starting to realize you don't need a gym anymore to be a fitness person. You can be entirely in an online space, but it wasn't a convincing change yet. We were all kind of like, is that real? So we had such a home base established. And I was also leaving this extended family I had. I don't have brothers or sisters. So my brothers are Berto, Brad, and Jeff, and they lived in Stockton, Portola, and the Bay Area. So all right around me in Sacramento. And Portola's just on the other side of Reno on the California side. So I said to Barb, UC Davis, or we change our whole lives when we go to New Zealand. And without hesitation, she said, New Zealand. And I was like, okay, we're going to do it. And that was where I first was like, okay, I'm now going to go on a trajectory where I'm not just a coach. I am going to be a science communicator. I'm going to be a researcher, and I'm going to wear multiple hats. So I'm an athlete, I'm an educator, I'm a researcher, and I'm a coach. And I'm going to have to find a way to balance all that without, losing my mind or failing in all of them. How
did you narrow down what your PhD would be in?
This was something I had thought a lot about during my coursework-based master's. So we had a pretty cool class. The master's was cool because it taught you how to be a connoisseur, a consumer of research, right? How to read research. We had some methods classes that were focused on things, and we had to write an annotated bibliography on a topic that was not yet fully explored. And something that was fascinating to me among, 10 other topics, I was very curious, was why is it that a sports nutrition text tells me I only need, the equivalent of 0.6, 0.7 grams per pound of protein. Bodybuilders are telling me I need 2 grams per pound of protein. And I was trying to figure out okay,
Yeah, I know this is where the podcast stops and the ad starts, and most of you guys just want to skip ahead. But hang on, because this one actually matters to me. You all know who John Meadows was. John and I were very close friends. So I'm proud to partner with Granite, which was his company. The principles and values that he had as a person, he instilled into the company. The Meadows whey protein, it's just simply whey. The way that I use that is right after training because I want it to digest faster. I want it to get into my system faster. The other product is creatine, which is like a no-brainer at this point. Everybody should use creatine. Even if they don't train, everybody should be using creatine just for the neural benefits associated with that. Right now, you can get 10% off with code TableTalk at granitenutrition.com. If you've ever respected John, this is how we keep his legacy alive.
Bodybuilders they don't need sports science to be big. They're already big. Sports science can potentially support that. It can take sport to the next level. It can help us iron out details, but let's not pretend that athletes have needed sports science. They have benefited from sports science, right? So I was like, they're probably overdoing it because that's bodybuilders. More is better. But are they overdoing it that much? Do they really, are their observations so far off that they're tripling the protein intakes that they would actually benefit from? So I started digging into the research, and one of the things that I thought about was that the largest changes to people's physiques typically happen during contest prep. It's where you notice the most. And when you're in an energy deficit, you're doing cardio, you're lifting weights, you're getting really, really lean, and you're pushing yourself to the extremes, there are actually arguments for each one of those cases that a higher protein intake might help with retaining muscle and also helping with, therefore, losing more fat. Because if you're losing muscle while you're dieting, then you're losing less fat. That's just where the energy's got to come from. And that formed my hypothesis for my thesis that I wanted to do for my second master's was, is there an argument for a higher protein intake when you have all of these kind of things converging? You have a lean person lifting weights and doing cardio in a deficit and trying to get really, really lean. Is that the time point when maybe you could benefit from higher protein intake than is traditionally recommended? So that's what I went out to do, was to compare a moderate protein intake that your typical sports nutrition text would suggest to something higher, like closer to 1.3, 1.4 grams per pound. Not quite as high as some of the more extreme versions were, but that was what I was really interested in. And I actually had to cyber beg to do it because the move to New Zealand is not cheap. We had to, essentially, we accumulated around $20,000 and spent it within weeks of being there to get our cats over, to get the plane tickets, to pay for my tuition. And we sold our cars. We were living very tightly for a while. And one of the things I did to help fund the research was I got on, I don't think it was GoFundMe. It was whatever the equivalent was in 2012 or 11. And I said, hey, I want to give back to the lifting community. Here's a question that we always debate and ask about. And you get the more bro-minded or the more research-minded people yelling at each other on the forums. I want to actually go out and study this and try to see if I can get us closer to an answer. If you guys are willing to help me, make sure I'm living in a home, not on the street while I do this, I'd be very grateful. And I'm eternally grateful to the lifting community because they gave me close to $5,000. And that literally made the difference of us being able to go to New Zealand and not be in debt. So that's the kind of motivation I had going there. I'm like, okay, now I've taken people's money to go do this. So I'm all in. And I need to give back because I've been given so much. So it was definitely driven by a sense of duty, I think is probably the best word for it. Because I have pride in duty. It's not an obligation. It's something that I've chosen and that I've also been, there's some expectation. I've said I'm going to do something. You gave me money and I want to do it. And I also want to give back. So there was just a really huge change in my life, moving from California, going across the land into a foreign country, and realizing that I had a successful business on my hands that could make that possible. So I still look back on that in that time period with kind of like, man, that was risky, but it paid off.
Yeah. Did it create more focus though, once you got there? Because a lot of the I'll say distractions are eliminated.
Yeah.
Because
man, Dave, I look back at some of the things I did. I'm productive now. And I think that's one of the reasons. And one of the things I love about contest prep for bodybuilding is it forces you into this, I would say, mission-oriented mindset that is unlike other things that would do that. In 2011, to save up the money that we could go over there, it wasn't just that GoFundMe. I also was doing personal training. I had a full roster list at 3DMJ of online clients. I was doing my master's. I was also preparing for the master's I was going to do. So I was writing my proposal for the master's while I was still finishing my master's. So like for a 3-month period, I was in 2 master's degrees essentially. And I was also contest prepping for my 2011 season where I won that pro card. I had 2 hours of time to myself every day where I wasn't doing something. And Barb and I would sit there and we'd watch like The Wire or Netflix, eat dinner, and then go to sleep and start again. So I was purposely going to do cardio at the gym, not just taking walks around, so I could study. So, okay, I got 30 minutes here. Like, what's my next assignment? Let's get the exercise physiology textbook out. And I realized how, like, this is something I love about bodybuilding is it keeps expanding my self-efficacy and letting me know how much I can take and what I can do. And if I put my mind to it and I'm focused. So for that almost 1 year buildup, I think it was like 8 months, was the busiest I'd ever been. It prepared me for doing a second master's. It prepared me for a PhD. It prepared me for, tough times for our business during COVID, or just during personal tragedies. So I have always used bodybuilding as this outlet to prove to myself that I'm as capable as I might hope to be. And I have sometimes definitely found my limit. I have made mistakes. I have, let something slip, whether it's a personal relationship that I wish I hadn't, my values in some minor way. I'm like, God, like, I don't want to be that asshole when I'm prep. I'm choosing to starve myself. So what I love about bodybuilding is that it exposes you to your personality tendencies. When you take away an animal's food and when you force them into a state of feeling like they're in a state of survival, a lot of the social niceties start to just go away. And you have to force yourself to still be an adult. And all of the things that, you worked through, being a child and a teenager to be palatable to other humans and to be nice and to be, a productive, nice, kind member of society. It's easy to let that stuff slip. And then you get to see like, oh yeah, I do have to exert work to be the person I want to be the man I say I am. There actually is work. And when it's stripped all away, it's kind of like you watch the Walking Dead or the zombie movies. You're like, okay, we have degraded to a place and only some people have retained their morality and their humanness. And I like that about bodybuilding because it exposes you and then you have to decide, what are you going to do about it? And what things are where do you draw the line in the sand? And doing that as a coach for other people is incredibly rewarding. So it's just this feed forward thing. So anyway, to answer your question, I was so busy from 2011 until 2017 when I finished my PhD. There was very little time outside of work, competition, coaching, study, or things adjacent to that. And thank God I love what I do, or I wouldn't have been able to do it. So
what were your thoughts on the protein after your PhD?
Yeah. So my PhD took a slightly different direction. I had it all planned out. I did a second master's, which got me into the PhD. The PhD, I wanted to focus on powerlifting because that was my two loves, right? So for my master's, my second master's, my conclusions were based upon the limited data I was able to produce and a systematic review that I did was that there probably is a strong argument to have a slightly higher protein intake while dieting, especially if you're lifting weights, especially if you're getting really, really lean. And I did a systematic review of the literature. I published that. That was my first publication. And I looked at all the studies that met the inclusion criteria of those things, like lean people lifting weights, trying to get leaner. And you generally saw that higher protein intakes were associated with better muscle retention. And coming full circle now, we just recently just earlier this year, published a meta-regression, which is just saying, hey, we did that same systematic review, updated it 10 years later, and then we were able to actually do a statistical analysis to say, instead of looking at 6 studies, we looked at like over 24, and we actually created a statistical model that would predict changes in fat-free mass with changes in protein intake in lean dieting individuals. And it wasn't the exact same numbers, but the general principle held true. And now we have a higher quality of evidence to say, yeah, actually, we do think if we look at our research on protein intake and at maintenance or a surplus to build muscle, slightly higher intake is probably necessary to not lose muscle when you're dieting, depending upon things like how lean are you male or female? There might be some sex differences. How large is your deficit? What is your training like? Those are difficult variables to get the exact effect on, but the general principle is, slightly higher protein intake is probably better while dieting.
Right. I got a little ahead of myself because your PhD was in like autoregulation, volume, and
yes.
And that was for powerlifting, or was that just for training altogether?
It was specifically in powerlifting.
Okay.
Yeah. So right after I had submitted and finished my master's thesis and graduated with my second master's, I got the opportunity to attend a seminar that was in Sydney, which is, most stuff is, it's not coming out internationally yet. And it was Mike T and the RTS crew, along with Dr. Mike Zerdos, who was famous for kind of popularizing daily undulating, programming and periodization in the kind of the mid-teens era in the powerlifting community. So I went out to Sydney, met both of them, and I had been following Mike T since probably 2008 or 9. Loved his stuff, loved the way he thought about things, individualization, just a complete different thinker in that current community at the time. And we hit it off. I got along really well with them, and I said, Mike, what do you think about me doing a PhD like on your system? And he's like, I love it. And he was very clear from the start. He was like, and if things look like they could be better, or if it doesn't work the way I think it does, or if the constructs I have in my mind don't pan out, let me know. So he was like kind of an unofficial advisor on my initial, thesis. And then so was Dr. Zerdos, because he was very interested in that as well. And then once I did my confirmation, which is basically you propose what you want to do for the next 2 years of your PhD for the data collection phase. One of the internal reviewers that we had at AUT said, I think Dr. Zerdos should actually be one of your supervisors, not just this external advisor. So he became my tertiary supervisor. And then I had Dr. John Cronin, my primary, and I had Dr. Adam Story as my secondary, who was also my Olympic weightlifting coach for a while. And he actually represented New Zealand at the Olympics as the coach for them. So I had a really cool team of people to support me. And I was getting to communicate with, Mike Toucher about like, okay, here's what I'm planning on doing. I want to see, what happens if we use these, I think they were called fatigue percentages at the time. They're a method of, depending upon how much your RPE decays set to set, we change load and we try to get more stress, more or less volume. So it's a volume autoregulation tool. And then also just if powerlifters are using RPE, what loads do they select if they use RPE to hit a certain target? How accurate are they? How do they look back and go, okay, based upon the load I thought I would use versus what I actually did, what happens? Did I choose a higher or lower load? What occurs when people are doing load programming with RPE? And then finally, for my capstone actual training project, I went out to Florida Atlantic University, where Dr. Zerdos has his lab, and I lived out of a cheap hotel for two and a half months, and I collected data 6 days a week, 60 hours a week for an actual training study where we took trained participants and we put them into a squat bench protocol that was either percentage 1RM based or RPE based to try to get to the same pattern. And the reps and the loads, the loads weren't matched, but the reps and the exercises and the number of sets were matched, and wanted to see what would happen.
How did you anchor the RPE? Great
question. So anchoring in RPE it's a big issue. If you look back at RPE, like in the modern era, people think Mike T's RPE, but RPE has been around since, Gunnar Borg in 1970, right? So the original RPE scales, anchoring was a big issue. You would see much poorer precision and reliability in studies where you would use RPE in subjects of different training experience, backgrounds. So someone, think about it this way. If I get a Marine who's been a marathon runner at a high level for 10 years, or someone who's never worked out before, and I have them do a hard set of 5 on a chest press, do you think they're going to give that the same RPE on a scale that says moderate, hard, or maximal? Even if it was to failure, and they did the 5th rep, the Marine's going to go, yeah, it's a 6. I've done harder things, because it's not anchored or specific to how many more reps could you do? Or how much more load do you think you could have done for the same number of reps? And that anchoring is more or less built into the RIR, so the repetitions in reserve based RPE scale. So the RPE scale we used was mostly modeled off of the one that Mike T was using at the time. So instead of saying 7 is hard, it said 7, 3 more reps is what you think you could do.
At that time, wasn't he using bar speed, like a tendo unit for that?
To some degree. So he was just starting to experiment with tendos, but he would use kind of them in isolation, or he would use them to confirm one another.
Okay.
But he definitely had an RPE scale where 9.5 was maybe I could have got another rep, or I could have done a little bit more load. A 10 was I couldn't have done more load or more reps. A 9 was I could have done another rep with it. 8 was 2, 7 was 3. So I argued that this is a pretty useful scale for resistance training precisely because of what you said. When you look at the typical category ratio 0 to 10 Borg scale that had been developed in the 80s after the original 6 to 20, it was not great at providing intuitive scores for resistance training. You would get people who would go to failure on a given lift and rate it as an 8. It had been shown in like 3 studies, right? So it's being anchored to that person's experience, not to what you want. And it was only when you would have someone do an anchoring session. You bring them in for a familiarization session. Okay, I'm going to have you do an XRM, 5RM, 3RM, 10RM, or whatever. Okay, that is what we're going to call a 10 RP. And the participant goes, okay, great. And now we're going to do 70% of that. What would you call that? Oh, that was a 7, you know? So you can get good reliability out of the Borg scale if you anchor it. But we didn't need to do that, is what essentially the research has shown on the RIR-based RPE, because it's built in. Mm-hmm. You do get some people who are better, or certain conditions which elicit more accurate RIR or RPE scores, RIR-based RPE scores, but the anchoring portion is built in, and it's more about their experience, and then what's their sensations.
I'm always looking for ways to improve my training, business, life, but none of that matters if my sleep is trash. If your sleep sucks, your recovery and performance is compromised. Sleep is the ultimate recovery tool, and temperature plays a massive role in this. This is where the Chili Pad comes in. It's a water-based, temperature-controlled mattress topper that fits any bed. You can set the temperature from 55 degrees to 115 degrees and even schedule changes throughout the night. It also has dual zone control, so I can stay cool while my wife stays warm. Visit www.sleepme/tabletalk to get 20% off your Chili Pad with code TABLETALK. This special offer is available for Table Talk listeners and only for a limited time. Order it today with free shipping and try it out for 30 days. You can return it for free if you don't like it with their Sleep Me trial. Visit www.sleepme/tabletalk and see why cold sleep is your ultimate ally in performance and recovery.
So if you take someone and they do a set of 20 to failure on squats, and you ask them on rep, say 17, how many more reps do you think you can do? They're much more likely to say, oh, just 1 more, than if they're on their 7th rep out of 10. Mm-hmm. Because the discomfort, the kind of global cardiometabolic fatigue they're experiencing and all the sensations related to it is much more likely to make them think that they can't do more reps than what's accurate. So there are things that make RIR prediction far less accurate, but they're not typical things that powerlifters do.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, the powerlifters are going to be more in tune as well because they're doing more sessions in the lower repetition ranges, so they know.
Yes.
You know, the only variable I could see would be how to control for heightened state.
Yes.
Right? Because you have a training max and competitive max, but I doubt in the setting that you're talking about, they're going to be in a competitive max state, you know, all the time. Or maybe they were, and that can become a problem in itself.
Yeah, it's a funny thing. So when you talk about training to failure and you talk to some people who are, I'd say, more like in the trenches based, they often question the protocols that are being done. They like people can't train like that regularly and go to failure, you know, like 4 sets of 10 on leg press and squats in the same session, all to failure. And they're thinking about their environment. Like, okay, I'm amped up, I'm ready to rock. I can only do low volume with that. I can't recover. And they're forgetting the training study, only lasted 8 weeks. And that these are, yes, they're trained participants, but these are people squatting 3 plates at the same body weight as you who squats 4 for reps, right? They can only give themselves so much fatigue. And more importantly, they're actually being motivated by a team of researchers yelling at them. So they got 6 grad students around them yelling, go, 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 you got this, let's go. And it's actually one of the most hardcore environments you'll ever see. The training that people do in studies, they often report is the hardest they've ever trained. And I think you actually need to consider that creates a bit of an artificial effect. So there is definitely a lab effect, Not that every lab is the same, but verbal motivation is a huge part of exercise science because it's been known for decades that if you yell at someone on an ergometer, you're going to get higher watts, right? Same thing with a 1RM, and that's exactly why you get psyched up. So when you do a research study and you're trying to create a homogeneous intensity, subjective intensity, you are kind of putting them in a place like, let's go. Like, you know, so when you are doing actual RIR accuracy research, where you get the actual RIR, because you train them until they hit failure on whatever movement, so long as it's safe, and then they call out at different target RIRs mid-set. So the traditional style of how you do this research is you do bench press, and you put on 70, 80, 90% of 1RM, whatever you're interested in, and they go to failure. You get spotters, you get people yelling at them, you create that environment. It's an acute study. They don't have to do this for 10 weeks. And when they think they have 5 left in the tank, when they're at lockout, they yell 5. When they think they have 3, 2, 1, whatever left in the tank, whatever you're interested in comparing, they yell out that number. And so there are some issues with that. Does it become a self-fulfilling prophecy? If I yell out 3, am I only going to get 3?
Yeah.
But what we do see is that there are differences in different populations, movements, training experience in some cases, depending upon the study. And the most notable one is higher versus lower reps, right? But if you look at the research on well-trained strength athletes and especially powerlifters, they are deadly accurate. And it makes sense, right? Like powerlifting is the sport of predicting what do I have left. You know, the person who's going 5 for 9, they learn real quick when they were off, right? It's the price is right. You know, if you're up 1 cent above it, you don't get anything. You know, you miss that lift. So even the powerlifters who initially gave pushback, like, no, like what's submaximal? Like, let's go. Like kind of this kind of hardcore mentality of it's an ME day every time I'm thinking about anything related to RPE. I asked them, well, don't you think you should know if you could do 2 reps, 3 reps, 1 rep? Isn't that a valuable skill for someone who's trying to go 9 for 9 and get the best total out of themselves? And invariably, it's the guys who just hate RPE and like with this almost emotional sense that, you know, you look them up on open powerlifting and they're going 5 for 9, 6 for 9. They've got the attempt selection strategy that made a lot of sense maybe 25 years ago. You know, like, well, you go for your PR on your second and you shoot for the moon on the third. I'm like, you know, like, so, you know, they're very passion-driven powerlifters who almost had this aversion to the idea of this kind of over-technical approach that Mike T had. But I think the reason why it caught fire to some degree and did well was that it's hard to deny Mike T. Like, he was a World Games champion. He is doing things at the time that were unheard of as a drug-tested lifter. And his athletes were doing well from multiple different backgrounds. So it was very intriguing. And he was also so rational and calm about it. You know, he didn't get defensive. If he had something negative to say about the current status quo, he would do it in a respectful way. He would think about how he could be wrong, even when he was young, you know, like, and it's crazy to me that I'm actually older than Mike T, but he started, like, he was really, really good as a 19-year-old, you know? So he set the stage for me to then do what I did, because Dr. Zerdos and myself, and a huge credit to Dr. Zerdos, he's the one who first started kind of researching RPE in an academic setting. We couldn't have done it if it hadn't been so well established and integrated into at least the raw upcoming powerlifting community that was burgeoning right around that 2011-12 era, where the first, you know, like raw classic world champs happened, and then the raw explosion that's been taking the sport by storm. So really set the stage for me to be able to do a PhD on RPE in powerlifting.
So how did that all unfold?
Yeah, it was a really, really cool experience. You know, I had developed really tight links with the powerlifting community because I started competing there in Auckland, New Zealand. Just great people, really tight knit. And I was able to, basically, like, my PhD research consisted of me driving around in my like 20-year-old Toyota with the stadiometer, fractional plates, and a GymAware, which is like a more modern Nintendo unit, in my trunk, going to 5 different gyms that were the powerlifting gyms all around Auckland. So shout out to Get Strength, which is still going strong, and basically recruiting powerlifters who were nationally qualified. So if you look at all of the participants in the first like 4 chapters of my PhD, they're all people who have qualified for New Zealand Powerlifting Nationals, the IPF affiliate we had there. So I was just basically feeling like I was a powerlifting coach for my PhD, and setting people up on these kind of modified daily undulating programs that had auto regulation built in, and seeing what happened. What does it look like if we do a mock meet and we use and get the RPEs on all these lifts as well as the velocity? How does it differ between different, sexes, if there are differences? Who's more accurate and less, and why? What loads do powerlifters choose if we tell them, I want you to do a set of 8 at an 8 RPE relative to their established competition 1 RM? How often are we seeing people overshoot versus undershoot, stuff like that? And that is what basically I did for the first year and a half of my PhD. And then that final bit is, we planned the study, we set it up to be done in 1 semester over at FAU. I flew out, lived out of a hotel, didn't see my wife for 10 weeks, the longest we'd ever been apart. It was hard, but it was really great. The Florida Atlantic University lab, the muscle lab, is such a unique environment. And some of the lab assistants who were doing their undergrad or masters at that time, they met me, I met them, and they ended up coming out and eventually became my PhD student. So one of the coolest moments I had was now Dr. Colby Sousa. I think he was either at the end of his undergrad or at the start of his master's. He was this young kid who was helping spot and load my participants in the study I did in 2016. And now in 2024, he just got his PhD because he was like, Eric, I love what you're doing. It's super applied. I did a master's with Dr. Zerdos, and most of the PhD programs in the States are less applied. Sports science kind of was a late adopter in the US because we're so focused on diabetes, clinical health, and the S&C profession kind of ends at the master's degree in the States. And sport scientists were not really as much of a thing, ironically, in the States as they were in Europe and in Australia and New Zealand. So, Colby was like, I want to come out to New Zealand. And I've had so many people who are different versions of where I was at when I came out to New Zealand, and the opportunity to give back to them. Like, hey, I'm going to pick you up from the airport, stay in my house for a month while you get on your feet. I'm going to show you the ropes. And if you want to do powerlifting or bodybuilding research, come on over. Because I know how hard it is to get out here. I will bend over backwards for you. And we're going to do some cool muscle nerd stuff.
So what did you find after the study was concluded?
The biggest take homes from my research were that RPE is probably not going to be an absolute game changer in terms of 1RM strength gains, especially when you control for things. Looking back on the specific training study we did, it was pretty good strength gains in both groups and pretty large strength gains. And I think to some degree, when you're giving, say, intermediate level lifters the ability to gauge RPE or use a percentage 1RM based program, so long as the percentage 1RM based program is sufficiently effective, it's going to make you stronger. And what has come out in subsequent research is that it's not the proximity to failure that matters when you train, it's the load on the bar. Now, obviously, you can't do 10 reps with 90% of 1RM, maybe 3 or 4. So it constrains RIR. So we often associate with being close to failure with being heavy, but it's actually the act of the load itself that is really driving strength gains, at least the principal factor. But the interesting thing as well is that there are glimmers in the research that autoregulation is a general concept, whether using velocity-based training, RPE, it can give tools to a lifter that may allow them to progress faster. And that is one thing we did see. It was an 8-week study, was that the RPE-based group was training heavier, not lighter, because the percentage 1RM program, it's basically predicting. It's making a crystal ball estimation. We had them doing triples at 92.5% of their 1RM at the start. So something we think maybe they wouldn't be able to do for 3x3 at the end if they didn't get stronger. But of course they did get stronger, almost everybody. And no one missed reps in the percentage 1RM group, not even on a bad day. So and we had them rate RPE, even though they were using percentage 1RM. So we could compare what their perceived proximity to failure was. So while the RPE group kind of steadily went up into higher RPEs and heavier training, just kind of a linear, programmed approach within a daily undulating programming model, the RPE group did that and their loads just kind of steadily went up. And eventually they were training with loads in excess of their original 1RM. They're doing triples with 101% of their pretest 1RM on average, something like that. But the other group, because we had to predict and we didn't want them to actually miss reps, they were only doing it with, 92% of their earlier 1RM, which ended up only being like 80% of their final 1RM. So they ended up training lighter. So you have to think that what that told me is that while that may not have shown up in terms of the actual differences in the post-test 1RM in that 8-week period, if you don't keep a firm grip on what is your current strength levels, and if you just go off of old tested 1RM, you're going to end up lifting with too light of a load to get the same kind of stimulus. And I think the perception at the time was that RPE is primarily holding me back. But what RPE can do and should do is that it allows you to let the rope out when you can. Like if you have programmed in a more static program, I'm supposed to do a triple with 500 today, and that should be, equivalent to maybe my 5RM, and you smoke it, you better call that a warm-up and go up, right? Mm-hmm. The intention of the program was to have you at 2 RIR. And if you were at 5 RIR, do another set, right?
Yeah.
So that isn't something you can do in a controlled lab setting. Because you have to have a fair comparison to make some kind of conclusion as what's driving the effect. But the fact that we saw the loads kind of just diverge in the two groups, and that we had constrained these intermediate lifters who are making really good gains on this program, it makes you think like, okay, that probably wouldn't have continued if we'd gone more and more weeks. Even if we retest their 1RMs, you're just getting this like lag period each time where they're not lifting as heavy. Mm-hmm. And I think that would cumulatively summate over time to being a poorer stimulus. We didn't see significant differences between groups, but the effect sizes were a little higher in the RPE group. And small sample size research. And now that we have more studies on this topic, you can basically say that, hey, this auto-regulation tool, it's not a game changer, right? If you lift heavy, you lift progressively. It's not like it's a completely novel concept. And it's not like in the trenches, there aren't powerlifters who are going, oh, let me adjust the load, But as we got into the modern era, the interesting interaction, I think, and this is extending beyond the conclusions I have from the research, is that if we're talking about kind of the 20 teens, people are writing programs. It's not like you were going on Wednesday to do bench day with all of your buddies who would tell you, I think you need to go up. You have your more junior lifters, your more senior lifters, you have this group think and hopefully a nice synergistic relationship. And I got this when I was Olympic lifting, with the coach is going, let's go up 2 kilos there. Like I had my plan, but they are auto-regulating it.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And I think that happened much more naturally when you had these coaching groups and crews and teams who would come in on Monday, Wednesday, Friday for their lifts, and you do a little training on your own. But that stopped with the online coaching era. So you're getting a program that you're just kind of locked into and following that spreadsheet for the next 8 to 12 weeks. So I think what Mike T was doing and the research that I did supported that we're missing something if we move fully from the in-gym to the, on Google Sheets model of training powerlifters. We need to have some tools that can bring those critical elements to individualization and adjusting in real time to these types of programs. And now we're 2025, you've got your handler who is on live video for you at a meet, potentially. You're sending lifts on DM videos just after you do it to your coach, and they're telling you in session what to train or change sometimes. I don't think that's necessarily always the way you can do it in different time zones and everything with 50 clients, but it's so obvious to people that that's a key piece to training. It's not just set it and forget it. It never has been. And I don't want people to think that auto-regulation is, did you know that you should adjust your load? Like, yeah, of course we knew that. But I think as we've gotten more divorced from the original way that powerlifting and strength sport was done, with a coach with you there, with the lifting team and this communal approach to it, that we've had to create new systems to keep those elements that are important. So yeah, I think that's where the gold lies. And it's not revolutionary, but it is important. And it can allow you to progress potentially at a faster rate than you otherwise would have if you had much more of a kind of a rigid, traditional, percentage-based, don't touch it, just do what the program says approach.
Yeah. Sticking on auto-regulation, I'm going to define this very globally because it's kind of how I look at that. And this will be my bias. Then I'll have you poke holes in it, go down any rabbit hole out of what I'm about to say, because it's going to open a lot of doors. I've always believed that the difference between, an intermediate lifter or an advanced lifter is their ability to auto-regulate, right? So my statement will be, if you want to be great, you need to learn how to auto-regulate, right? Now, that's more from a global sense, and where I come from that is twofold. If we're talking about anchoring just in general, I'd want to anchor, how I would explain it is I need to anchor intensity. Mm-hmm. So percentage of a 1 rep max, the ability to straight 3, 2, 1, because it's kind of a different mental, physical component than say what a set of 8 to 12 could be.
Yeah.
That I would say we have to anchor effort. So I just kind of separate it, to effectively kind of guide somebody. How I would say the 2 RIR, 2 reps in reserve for the low end accessories on a training day, big movements working into smaller movements. We have to be on the same page, right? And a lot of the times with the powerlifting group, they do a horrible job when it comes to the lower end things, when it comes to that, either from a tempo perspective, there's times when they should train more explosively, but there's also times if they're doing dumbbell side races, they can just slow the fucking tempo down, and get more out of that for what they're trying to do from that. But basically anchoring those 2 components are a little bit different, right? And then the ability to auto-regulate on the day, because that's going to lead into the recovery volume for the whole time period. So the way I'll explain it is act like this is a video game and you got a full energy bar going into first heavy training day of the week. And if we're to do that heavy compound movement, squats, I don't care if it's conjugate, whatever it is, but it's going to be a heavier, type of movement. You don't want that to take 70% of the energy bar.
Yep.
And if it does, then you're going to have to ditch the secondary movement and some of the other things, because you have to have some of that energy left to be able to carry into, say, the bench day, the next day, or the day after that next day, right? So if you suck it all the way down, then what are you going to do? You can't really do that. Now, if it is at that 60%, then you can train that supplemental thing hard, but it would also play into if you're scheduled 5 sets of 5, right? Then where should that be after that? If it feels really good and it's still kind of on point percent-wise, RPR-wise, you don't jump and go heavier on the 5th one, because you have to think, how's that going to impact your ability to do what's rest in the session, or what's going to happen that next day, which could be different movement.
Yep.
And the next week, the next time you're going to do that movement. So it kind of all plays in there. And what I've noticed with the more experienced lifters is they know when, and usually with them, it's backing it down, right? They know when to back it down, but they also know when, if it does feel really, really good, they can take that low hanging fruit. But if they take that and they have to pay, if they strain too hard, then they know how to change what happens after that, or even that next training session if need be, and I call all of that, like there's a lot of doors that just pop, you see what I'm saying? Yeah. I call all of that the ability to learn how to auto-regulate. And the struggle is how to coach and teach somebody how to do that, because it starts with what you were talking about, like just with the one movement or the 3 movements, because it has to start there, because they're going to be the highest energy demand and the most important. Yeah. But it also applies to all these other things as well, because maybe they go easy on that, but they're dumb as hell on what they're doing after all that, from the strength athlete side. So we'll stay on the strength, like the power lifter, strongman side first, because the bodybuilding side, it's a little bit different, because you don't have that big anchor movement in there. That's what I would call high intensity. I define that as percentage of a 1 rep max. Sure. So I know you get that, but a lot of people that are listening, I think at least in these communities, they convolute intensity and effort. Yes. A bodybuilder, that's high intensity. And I'm like, it's actually like 60%. Yeah. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. So based upon what I just said, you can jump through any of those doors that you would like, because there's a lot of things going on in there. Yeah. So I'm big on terminology as an academic as well. I almost always use the term load. Yeah. I think of like percentage 1RM, because then it kind of cuts across that. And then I'll say proximity to failure. And then because the intensity of a bodybuilder, they're talking about how close to failure am I, or just like, how hardcore was the session. And intensity for powerlifters, they do mean like the percentage 1RM. So I think the biggest thing I want to start with in relation to what you said is that a lot of people, they constrain what auto-regulation really means to one variable, so I have posted numerous times over the year, like, just because you use RPE doesn't mean you have an auto-regulated program. That's load auto-regulation. But what about having a flexible template? Look, I get it. A power bar is a staple of every gym, but what do you do after that? This is Dave Tate from EliteFTS, here to talk to you about specialty bars. Specialty bars are what's going to take your training to the next level. You're probably already familiar with our SS yoke bar, which every gym should have, which he's using there, which provides comfort for the squat, especially if you're a washed up meathead like myself and you can no longer grab a bar, or you have shoulder injuries, or you're just looking for variation in your training. At EliteFTS, we have specialty bars that take care of all your training needs, from an American cambered press bar to fat bars, curl bars. We even have power bars. So head over to elitefts.com, toolbar, bars and weights, or blowout menu, bars and weights.
What if you have, you have these 4 target sessions you're going to do, but you might give yourself a flexible off day, based upon your recovery status, or you can flex in what might just be 3 triples at 80%, call it a heavy practice day, and then delay the hard day because you feel trashed when you go in, right? Or how do you auto-regulate volume? You need a system for all these things. And I think you're 100% correct that an advanced lifter can do some of these things, I'm going to say intuitively, but what I mean by that is that they just have years of pattern recognition.
Well, I think they get that way because they screwed up so many times that they know the consequence.
100%.
And what we're trying to do is to not have the younger lifters make those same mistakes.
Yes, exactly right. So, and that's the other thing I wanted to say is so much of applying auto-regulation, it co-varies with being a good educator and a good coach and a good mentor, because you know what you would do if you were in their shoes, but you aren't in their shoes. You don't know exactly what they're feeling. You don't know if they have the same tolerances. They definitely have a different personality. And you need to be able to figure out, okay, well, how do I teach them the tools that I would use to adjust for myself if you're kind of coming from the athlete perspective. And coming from the educator perspective, it's very overwhelming to tell someone that, anything can be auto-regulated. Like when you're given a simple program, like, I squat on this day, I bench on this day, I deadlift on this day, or if it's bodybuilding, I have chest, back, shoulders, arms, it is easier to understand. There's less moving parts. Your ability to kind of be constraining your knowledge and applying it is very helpful when you're a novice learner. Now, when you get more experience that, I could train, there's no reason I can't do lateral raises after my squats. Why not, right? And that can be freeing. Now you get away from any kind of dogmatic, rigid structure that provided the structure for you to actually think and understand your program when you're a novice. But now you're like, well, I'm going to break the rules because they're not helpful, right? They're getting in the way of what I'm trying to accomplish in this given scenario. And I think a lot of the times we inadvertently let novices think that those are rules rather than structures. Right? So I think it's really important when you first teach someone how to be a power lifter or how to lift, that you are teaching them auto-regulation, but you teach it in a more structured way. So we're going to maybe start with not having a flexible template, but I'm going to give you a program that is relatively within your means, but we are going to auto-regulate load selection. So I want you to videotape it. I want you to tell me what your RIR is. I want you to stick to the load for the first 4 weeks as an example of how I might teach this. But I want you to be rating your RPE. I want you to be rating your RIR. I want you to be looking at the association between how it felt and how it moved on camera and the bar speed. So you can start to create those associations. So it's the initial phase where I start teaching people about auto-regulation. I might constrain it to one training variable, and I might have them focus on what are the things they need to pay attention to auto-regulate, but they won't actually change things yet, right? Mm-hmm. And then I want them just to think about how they feel. So you can give me a session RPE, like how hard was the whole session? And I want you just to report to me in our coaching relationship, where did you feel recovered? I want you to notice where you felt stronger, the same load moved faster or slower, etc. So now they kind of know what to pay attention to, and they develop an awareness of those skills before I'm asking them to actually manipulate the variables with those skills that they haven't even developed yet. Mm-hmm. So some of the first things I do towards that mastery that you described of auto-regulation is just getting them an idea of what are the things I need to even pay attention to, and developing the skill of accurately rating RPE. Because like, okay, so here's a video. I did a triple. I'm pretty sure that I could have only done one more rep. And I go, well, I think maybe you could have got 2 more. I think you might have misgrooved here, but if you'd kept things tight and done it again, I think you could have gone again. And then the next step is, okay, now I'm going to build in some opportunities for you to test the waters. So we'll do our 3x3 at 80%. You'll rate the RPE. You're going to keep the load the same. Now I want you to do an AMRAP. Now you're going to do as many reps as possible. So you just did 3x3 at 80%, and you told me that they were all 7 RPEs. But now you just blew up 10 reps. So do we think after those sets in fatigue that is actually an accurate gauge? Or did you get more hyped? Okay, now you understand the effect of getting hyped up and why we might use a training max versus a a hype max or something like that. So that intermediate phase is where we actually start letting the rope out a little. That's not letting. I truly believe also, if you're going to use auto-regulation as a coach, that you need to take a more, what is described in the literature as an autonomy supportive coaching role, not this top-down hierarchical, you just do what I say, because that's a big mixed message. If you're telling someone to use auto-regulation, you're saying, you know yourself better than anyone else. You have the keys to be able to, at least eventually, as you develop the skill, be the most individualized, best version of yourself. I can't be in the gym, in the kitchen with you on a day-to-day basis, but I'm going to give you the tools to succeed. So it's like saying to someone, hey, I'm not going to feed you fish. I'm going to teach you to fish. No, you're going to eat salmon. And it's like, well, hold on. I thought I was fishing here, So I think you do need to start from the very beginning with letting the client know that to some degree they're in charge. The analogy I use is that if you're a novice powerlifter, you're still the captain of your ship. Like, this is your goal. You've never sailed that far before, but I'm your seasoned navigator, and I like that analogy because you can absolutely lean on your navigator. You're like, listen, I'm fresh out of naval school. I'm 20. You're 60. You're grizzled. You've got a parrot on your shoulder. You got a peg leg. You've been at sea. Like, you know what you're doing. I need to be the leader here, but like, you're my trusted person. I have brought you onto the ship for a reason. I've sought you out. Now can get away from the analogy. I'm paying you. You're an experienced coach. I value your expertise and I want your input. I don't just want a yes man. I don't want a wet blanket. I do want you to maybe tell me what to do, especially if they come from like a team sport background. You have to match them with the personality of what they want. But I think even if they ask you to step into a leadership role and they want to be the soldier, you need to tell them, what does a good soldier mean? So I get some athletes who don't like that more collaborative relationship. They want to listen. You're the boss. I'm the person. I'm gonna salute. And I go, okay, well, you're the team captain. If you come from this like team sport background, you're gonna need to make calls on you're the quarterback. You're the whole team. So you can't just follow whatever play we say no matter what. You got to adjust to the defense, right? So I explained to them that all of my expertise and if they want to see me as an authority in the relationship, I can only be good if I get the keys from them. So you are the person who is gathering all this data, and then I'm going to make a decision, and then I need you to tell me how it went. And if it didn't go well, you need to tell me that, because I can be wrong. So it's this fine balance of finding the right attitudinal disposition that gives the athlete what they want, but not letting them get to the point they'll go, listen, man, I'll drink blood. I'll do anything. I don't care. Like, you tell me what to do. I trust you 100%. Like, I don't want 100% trust. I want 100% communication. I need to know how things are working, and I need to gauge and change. Just as much as I'm teaching these auto-regulation skills, coaching is auto-regulation. Let's try this. It didn't work. Let's try something else, figure out why it didn't work. So no matter how you go about it, what it looks like in terms of like the leadership style, you have to let them know that they are the key to their own success, and they need to have that autonomy, and they need to be able to make decisions without your input, because that's just the nature of individual sport. You have to mentor athletes. It's not just do what I say, because you don't have the information they have, and you have to leverage their ability to be self-aware. And I don't know any good athletes who are completely body unaware, don't know how to look introspectively. I mean, even the freaks, they just get hurt or they burn out, right? Every good athlete I know, or more importantly, people who have maximized whatever the version of being their best is, regardless of whether they're 10th place at regionals or a world champion, they have this increasingly well-developed self-awareness. And I think that is the underpinning philosophy, coaching philosophy to auto-regulation. So I think you need to teach that, even though at the novice stage, you're asking them to just stick to the program, please, but rate your RPE, send me videos, and we'll talk about it. And then in the intermediate phase, you're giving them more opportunities to auto-regulate. I think it also fits well with the data on individualization. So we don't have a whole lot on strength training, but there is a fair amount on like endurance training. So you can auto-regulate like an endurance athlete's training based upon, say, heart rate variance. So HRV is this kind of metric that tells you about global parasympathetic or sympathetic dominance, your autonomic nervous system's recovery, and it tells you something about your overall physical state. And it's not very useful for strength because you can be feeling like dog crap and still hit a PR. But you can be feeling like dog crap and it will pretty reliably mean you're not going to be able to meet race pace, or you'll fatigue earlier, or you're more likely to get injured. So heart rate variance is an auto-regulation tool, that auto feedback tool for endurance athletes. And there have been studies showing that HRV guided training is superior to a fixed program. But there's also been studies showing that's only true if they're not novices. So individualized programs don't really make much of a difference when you're just adapting to everything. And the amount of fatigue you can handle or even inducing yourself is constrained. The amount of progress you can make is going to be rapid to some degree if you're just kind of in the right ballpark direction. So you don't really need to auto-regulate as a novice, but you will need to auto-regulate to be great, as you said. And you're going to, be kind of a late adopter if you get to this point where you need to individualize and you don't know how, because you've just followed whatever the program says, or you've just trained as hard as possible all the time, which is the two kind of directions people tend to go. They're too analytical. They just follow the program and they don't know how to adjust it when it stalls. They don't know how to individualize. They just follow what was on the paper, or they have just always trained like an animal and they get to a point where the cavemanning it is resulting in more injury than progress.
Well, that's the dilemma, right? Because they think they need to do what they did to get there when they're there, and sometimes it's inverse, of what it is, because their skill and proficiency in the lift is also increased, so their ability to recruit more muscle at one time is way different when they're advanced than when they're novice.
Absolutely.
Which is going to take more out of them. To stay on the main lifts, what have you found with peaking of those main lifts going into, and then I want to get into like the volume of not the main lifts, but hypertrophy and all that, but to conclude the powerlifting part, like what have you found with the peaking process?
Yeah, the peaking process is interesting. There's definitely some generalities that I have found from coaching a lot of athletes over the years, but then there are also pretty big individual differences. So as a general rule, and again, my experience is almost entirely restricted to raw powerlifting. So that probably matters. I have found that lighter weight classes, and I say that instead of what I might have said when I was younger, like women versus men, because now I've worked with 66, 74 kilo men, and they operate in a similar way. Maybe it's because of the absolute load relative to their body, or something else. I don't know, but it's a pretty consistent thing I've seen when I'm working with like middleweights or lightweights equivalent lifters, that you can push that very close to competition. And if you don't, they can actually detrain a little bit and you won't be as fresh of a state. However, if you're working with a 105 kilo male, a 120 kilo male, a super heavyweight, which I have limited but some experience with, it definitely seems more like the era of what I heard from super training, or like basically going all the way back to the greats of the 90s, the 80s of, I don't do my last heavy deadlift until I'm 2 weeks out or 1 week out. So for example, Bryce Lewis, 105 kilo, 2018 world champ, he was someone who we adjusted his peaking schedule over time so that he pulled the opener practice for squat, bench, and deadlift occurred on different days. So we would be, I think, 4 to 5 days out, and we would hit bench, and around the 1 week out mark, we would do squat, and then midway into that week, so 10 days out, we would do deadlift. And that's still pretty close to comp. And it wasn't like we didn't do anything else, but we were probably not touching anything over, 85% of 1RM on deadlift after that, and it would decline. And I found that definitely relative to the other lifts, less is more for the deadlift. There are caveats to that if someone is a conventional puller versus sumo puller, in my experience, with typically at a high level, people who are sumo pullers are also built quite well to sumo deadlift. It's not like they're just poorly built for all deadlifts and they're trying to be less shitty and they, their back's going to be toast no matter what. But they can stay nice and upright. Then, I find that may even differ as well. Like you can push a sumo deadlifter a little closer to competition than a conventional. So in the general volume, in raw powerlifting, generally I find the highest frequency and the highest volumes are going to come in the form of bench press, and then squat after that, and then deadlift after that. And those are the generalities, right? But the amount of individual differences are pretty wild. Especially when you get unique anthropometrics, someone with like really long arms who is an amazing deadlifter. I have seen top level, like actually right now, Kjell Beckland, who is a 74 kilo world champ, who's battling with Taylor Atwood back in the day, came back to the sport, dropped to 66 and put up the 770 total. The raw drug-free 66 kilo lifter, just annihilated the old world record by like 60 kilos. And I think when I was talking to him, he's from Norway. I met him back in the day when I was doing a conference out there. He was deadlifting 4 or 5 times a week, But you look at his build and you're like, okay, that makes sense. That's a block pull for everyone else, right? So there are always exceptions to rules, but the general thing I find is that those tend to be kind of just fixed in place relative to one another for the average lifter in these different classes at a high level. But then how you program really does change things as well. So you can choose to leverage a program that is a lot higher in volume or a lot higher in frequency if you regulate the load or regulate the RPE. And then you will find that they can peak a lot later if you pull back volume, the thing that you pushed, right? And the inverse is true, right? If you're doing a really low volume and they can't handle as much, but they're very used to pushing quite heavy, then you can peak a little bit later and they don't need as much stimulus to hold on to it. Are you lowering the ceiling? Maybe, but you don't know until you've kind of compared the counterfactual over time. So I think you will find different peaking observations in different quote unquote camps of people, because if I love anecdotal evidence, but it's always constrained to the system you set it up in, right? So if you have a group of people and they're happy to auto-regulate and they're happy to do it this certain way, but they always have an ME day no more than once or twice per week on a given lift, then you've constrained the amount of possible anecdotes they can see. So they can go, no, that doesn't work. Well, it doesn't work if you're only using 90% plus lifts on that lift 1 to 2 times per week, because now that eliminates a whole lot of other frequency and volume options. But if you're taking an entirely different approach, like our perception of what Shaco was, where we're working in the 70 to 80% range and you're training each lift 4 to 6 times per week, it's a totally different ball game. And you hang out with that crew and you go like, well, you got to take your last deadlift 2 weeks out. And they're like, or you mean 2 days out? You're like, what? So you can find these very large differences in anecdotes, but they are embedded within a system that is more dominant in frequency or volume, or more dominant in intensity, or more sometimes like unique ones, dominant in frequency and intensity, but low volume per session. Well,
in each one of those, there's also adaptation to that program, which occurs over time of them doing that program.
Absolutely.
Which you kind of touched on this earlier with the heavier lifters. And I've often wondered this because, in multiply, you're dealing with loads heavier than what they really can squat, right? It's the fact. Nobody's going to argue with me about that.
Correct.
But when it is I don't want to put 250 pound plus, right? Because I don't know if I generally want to put 242s in here, sure. But 275, 308s, and then say the squat ramps up 900, 1,000, then their ability to be able to recover from the heavy bouts drops, right? And on an extreme level, if Donnie Thompson, Dave Hoff, some of these other ones would reduce the squat down really just to one heavy one a month. And I ping pong back and forth with this one a lot because we really don't know what's going on through the spine, and just nerves in general with that much load on the back, right? So there's probably something maybe to recover from there. And so it could be that. But on the other end, it could be they're just not conditioned enough to be able to recover from it. Where in the lighter classes, their conditioning is generally going to be better because they're just not heavier. body weight matters. People don't like when I say that, but body weight matters because you got to walk around with 270 pounds all the time. And that's just recovery demand of just being heavy, which I can let you elaborate on that one, which probably should as well. But what are your thoughts on that?
I think there's multiple really interesting interacting factors here that I am really thankful that I've been exposed to the whole gambit of strength sports. Like if you talk to Olympic weightlifters about frequency, you get a very different answer than bodybuilders or powerlifters, even at the same body weight, same relative strength levels. And, I came into powerlifting interested in raw and at the time when raw started exploding. So I don't think I realized just how different certain things about equip lifting are until I got a little deeper in the sport and got exposed to it. I remember one day I went to get strength and I was doing data collection for my PhD, and I had 5 people go through a protocol. Some of them were going on different platforms at the same time, but I was there for 3 hours and I watched an equip lifter start and finish at the same time as me doing a bench and accessory session. And I realized that him getting in and out of his shirt and the logistical challenge of that, and the fact that he was, benching something like close to my squat at the same body weight and the extra loads, like, wow, this is not the same type of training. So I do wonder how much the fact that people are lifting an equipment and they have to get in and out of it, and they need basically a pit crew around them to do it. And it's, oh man, walking out with knee wraps, that's the only thing I've done. I've done raw with wraps, and I was like, whoa, this is this is uncomfortable. This isn't a tight SBD sleeve, So that style of training, especially I would imagine multiply, is just, because this was an IPF gym, so this was single ply. I'm like, man, there's like the frequency and the volume that you can do during certain training phases when you're in and out of equipment more, it's a completely different animal. So the volume is constrained for logistical reasons. So you're not going to get the opportunity to see, well, what if I just did a whole bunch of, high volume training of equip lifting? How do you pay the bills? You got to be in the gym 10 hours a week, 10 hours a day, excuse me. So I think that's one thing. Another thing that I think is really interesting that kind of throws, and that might be a large part of it, but I think one thing that makes me question, does it have to be this way for the super heavies? It's strongman, because when you look at what they're doing and the fact that they're the same body weight, and many of them have a background in powerlifting, and they went, well, let me just do that for 10 reps, and these are giant people lifting incredibly heavy loads for multiple events over multiple days, and they live, and they can put up max lifts 2 days in a row using the same muscle groups. You kind of have to go like, do I really need 2 weeks between?
I think you're on the same page, man. Like, is this conditioning? Is it, like I said, I ping pong back and forth to the whole thing because even if it's the IPF and it is single ply, you still see the same thing.
Yes.
With the heavier ones. And I wonder, if they, over a long time, increase the work capacity of of what they're doing in general, if that would change. And
I think it would, Dave. And I also think there's an undeniable physiological difference between absolute load, even though you might be at the same relative load as someone else. So if we just think about physics, if we take me, 80% of my best 1RM squat, it's going to be 400 pounds, right? And if I can do 8 reps with 400 pounds and we calculate the distance, there is a known metabolic cost of that. I have to generate a certain amount of ATP. There's no way around that. Now, if you say, Eric, what if you chose better parents? Eric, what if you, also decided to not stay drug-free and you were a top level under 90 strongman or top, like you were best of the best. Like what if I was John Hack, basically, right? Who I've met. Incredible strength, right? If I could do the same set at 80% of 1RM with 200 more pounds, there's undeniable 50% more energy expenditure. There's no way around it. Even though we both did the same RPE, the same sets, the same exercise, it's not the same.
But when the adaptations account for the ability to still be able to do it.
To some degree, but I think when you are taking the same body mass of person, obviously there's going to be more lean mass.
Yeah.
You know, if we take a 90 kilo version of me that can do 600 pounds for 8 versus 400 pounds for 8, there's going to be different body composition, or at least different intrinsic muscle qualities, right? Just far better strength efficiency per unit of tissue of might, you know. There is no way around it that 8 reps at 80% for that person and that person is going to require higher recovery demand, at least acutely. You can't, I might be able to rest 5 minutes. They're not going to be able to. And even if we're both in very good cardiorespiratory shape, because it's just such a high output. And I think when we look at strongman, that is probably one of the most impressive things about it to me, is you were just asked to do an AMRAP with 800 pounds, you know, and you're like, whoa, let's actually think about the output there. That's like running an 800 meter sprint in terms of just the raw output. Different energy systems, I'll grant you that. Not completely different, but definitely different. And then you think like, okay, wow. So maybe that's part of the reason why the volumes and the loads are constrained, because even though you could take a top level strongman and you can take a top level super heavy powerlifter, they're going to be training with higher volumes, higher frequencies, and they're going to seem a lot more resilient and in better condition. But if you compare, and this is again why I'm so fortunate to be exposed to many different strength sports. If you compare an under like 90 kilo strongman at the highest level and an unlimited strongman at the highest level, the under 90 guy is also doing more volume and more frequency than the guy who's unlimited. So it scales up, but but there's still something related to the body mass and absolute strength.
Yeah. So when we jump over to hypertrophy,
let's go.
All right. This is what you live. That's bodybuilding, right? And we stay with the strength athlete. And so there's 2 conversations here. We have a dedicated hypertrophy block, right? Then we'll have the hypertrophy training that's going to happen while they're peaking not peaking as in the last couple of weeks, but their prep phase, which is the new term that's not new, 10 years old, but what's new to me, right? Their prep phase, and it's different. So if it's that hypertrophy phase and it's a designated hypertrophy phase, it's going to more closely resemble bodybuilding.
Yes.
All right. And with that, when we're talking about volume, right? Because that's the thing that's debated, like volume, effective reps, effective sets, all these other things. And I'll let you go into detail on all those, but the one thing that I kind of like want to scream from the void when it comes to that is when the volume that you're doing, because we're adaptable creatures. And, you know, I saw what Meadows was doing with volume. When it would be high, it would be low. And it didn't go from like 3 sets to 30. No. You know, it scales up over a period of time. And so you're going to adapt to that. So when I hear the debates of the high volume, low volume, there's like a whole piece that's like missing. Like, are you adapting to that work, to the ability to do that workload? But then what would circle back on that is, well, you still don't need that workload anyhow. Yeah. Because science says you only need this. And I'm like, there's something missing here. Yeah. And I don't quite know what that is. You know, so elaborate on that, right? Sure. So you'd have the effective reps, the effective sets, but then the volume, which would probably be in that order, right? The effective reps, the effective sets, and then the volume would be the way to cover that. Absolutely. I think the first thing to look at is the concept of effective reps or effective sets. And that is like, how much stimulus am I getting out of this unit of volume? And the answer is context dependent. So when we look at the relationship between volume and hypertrophy, and then volume and 1RM strength gains, when we have like big meta regressions, we look at all the data we've been collecting for 30 plus years, we don't see the same relationship. So you get a diminishing returns effect in both. If you calculate this as number of sets per week per muscle or per lift, and the point of diminishing returns is way right shifted for hypertrophy. You know, like there's basically the idea of if you can do more and you can recover from it and it's not causing other issues and other variables, like it's not making you pull down the intensity or proximate to failure, you're not pacing yourself, it may induce a increasingly less stimulus for hypertrophy. You're getting much more out of your first 4 or 5 sets per week. And, you know,
if you get up to 25 sets, it might be better than 15, but the relative difference of going from 1 set to 4 is more than going from 15 to say 25, right? So it's this increasingly worse return on investment is what describes the overall relationship. That happens way earlier for strength. And in research, a lot of the times it's not the kind of strength training we're thinking of. It's not singles, to 8. It's sets of like 9 to 10. And then they're testing 1 RM strength afterwards. But we start to see that once you've done like 5 or 6 sets in a week, you're not getting much more out of it. But that's in the context of the research that we have, which is typically 6 to 12 weeks long. And we know, I would say, we know quite clearly that larger muscles produce more force. So we kind of are looking at the volume relationship in terms of long-term strength capacity, that's hypertrophy, and then peaking. If I think that the typical strength study where we're actually going to end in a 1 RM and compare it to our pretest 1 RM, the thing that's akin to is the peaking block or the prep block. It's the last 8 to 12 weeks before your meet. The hypertrophy work you do in that period is going to have very little direct transfer that's measurable over that time period to strength. And the additional volume on building work capacity, or doing a lot of, say, triples. It's not like if you did 1 triple on 3 days versus 3 triples on 5 days, it might be a little different, but it would be a lot less than most people think on average for people. So when we're talking about what is the key variable, proximity to failure and number of sets are our best big picture ideas around what is driving hypertrophy. And then load on the bar and number of sets with a way less effective number of sets in the short term, which is all the research we have. We have very few studies that are over even 16 weeks, right? So we don't know a whole lot about long-term strength development, but we can extrapolate from what are the determinants of strength. And if hypertrophy is important, if we accept that, then we kind of have to live in both worlds as a strength athlete. We need to think about really what I think periodization is best described as is an efficiency puzzle, right? It's if I want to get as big as possible, that's going to take away from the specific work on the skills of strength that I need to do. So that I shouldn't do all the time, or I can't be a bodybuilder purely. I have to think about how do I develop that long-term muscle size while becoming an expert in these lifts, right? The bodybuilder game is very different, and we're not going to get there yet, because then it's just, the movement is just a vehicle for volume and intensity, right? So that means, okay, I need to come up with some system, and we have endless systems, and they're all potentially valid, and some might be better in different contexts. But so long as they produce long-term strength, then you're clearly growing enough. So what is an effective set for hypertrophy? Well, generally for hypertrophy, we know that singles, doubles, triples, even maybe sets of 4, they don't last long enough to have a long enough stimulus, really, even though they might be heavy, to be on equal footing to say a moderate or high rep set. We have enough comparisons between what we would describe as heavy strength training, like a 2 to 4 RM versus say an 8 to 12 RM versus say a 25 to 35 RM, where we go, listen, you're going to have to maybe make up by doing a few more sets if you want to get the same hypertrophy stimulus on a set to set basis. So an effective set for hypertrophy needs to A, have enough reps in it, and then B, need to be close enough to failure. And that actually adjusts based upon the load. If we think about motor unit recruitment, we look at either EMG studies or we make some inferences from some other types of data. When you lift heavy enough, everything is on. You have to recruit everything to just overcome that load. And when you're lifting heavy enough, the influence of proximity to failure is less for hypertrophy. So if you're doing, say, a set of 6, you could probably stop at 2, 3, maybe even 4 RIR. And that might be quite comparable to going close to failure on a set of 10 to 20. Because you get to the same endpoint in different ways. If you do a set of 6 with a 3 RIR versus a set of 15 with a 0 RIR, in the end, you're both recruiting high threshold motor units. You're putting enough stress through them. They're probably going to grow. The way it occurs in a set of 15, 20, or 30 is that you're doing what's called motor unit substitution or motor unit cycling. So if you only have 60% of your 1 RM on the bar, you don't need the whole motor unit pool to move it, right? So you're doing your reps, and a motor unit starts to go, oh, I'm getting a lot of fatigued fibers here. It'll actually turn off and let the rest of the motor unit pool do the work. And then that happens again. And eventually it's just trying to like substitute and cycle in these motor units. And you get to the point where you're on your 30th rep out of 30 and they're all done. So you can no longer meet the ATP demands to meet the force demands for the set to continue. That just occurs at a pace far faster than you can do it when you have to recruit everything immediately, because you can't substitute a motor unit out when you're doing a 6 RM. You need them all just to do one rep, right? So that is the difference, is that it kind of all counts when it's heavy enough. And another way to think of that is from a hypertrophy perspective is if I need to get reasonably close to failure, let's say everything from a 5, 6, maybe even 10 RIR if you're a novice counts, because it's heavier than getting off the couch if you've never lifted weights before, right? Then if I'm lifting with 80% of my 1RM and I can only do 10 reps, then all of my reps are a 10 RIR or lower, right? So effective reps, I think some people draw much too hard of a line in the sand that doesn't comport with the data. It is true that the closer you get to failure on a set-by-set basis, not in the context of a whole program, the more stimulating that set in isolation is for hypertrophy. But some people will go, and only the last 5 reps count. I'm like, well, actually, if you look at the data, it's like there's a positive relationship from all the way from 10 RIR or to 0 RIR. Is that true if we're talking about elite level powerlifters or elite level bodybuilders? Probably not, but I don't have the data on that. We haven't collected thousands of studies on these people. I'm trying, but we're not there yet, right? So we know the general direction of that relationship. The closer you get to failure in isolation, more stimulative. So the effective reps model in a very general sense is true. You're going to get more stimulus closer to failure. And then if you meet the constraints of what we would call that set of having enough reps and being reasonably close to failure, and then modifying it based upon load, we can call that an effective set. So in my mind, the way I often describe this is, hey, if you're lifting in, say, the 4 to 8 RM range, you can be at a 1, 2, 3 RIR, and that set is probably going to count pretty well. If you're in kind of like the 8 to 12 RM range, we have data, 1 to 2 RIR is probably equivalent to actually failing. After that, you probably want to err on the side of, say, 0 to 1 RIR, maybe even hit failure. And then there's also exercise interactions. Like you probably wouldn't want to do that on a squat or deadlift or bench. You probably want to choose something that's a little more isolation-based, machine-based. And then you have to think about, okay, well, what phase of training am I in? So you get all these variables that explode. But essentially, effective sets and reps for hypertrophy are pretty clear. Close enough to failure, last long enough to stimulate something. For strength, it is heavy enough to get a decent amount of transfer. And that's pretty much it, And then the effect of volume starts to diminish way earlier for short-term strength gains. So it was effective reps, effective sets, and then what was the last piece?
Volume.
The volume, yeah. So the amount of volume that you can benefit from when you're doing specific work is low. I think some people, they think, oh, well, so strength training should be inherently low volume compared to bodybuilding. And I go, kind of. If we're talking about the prep phase itself, yes, because it is skill development, right? So I trend towards heavy enough specific work with as high of a frequency as the person can manage, and then I auto-regulate and adjust it in a peaking phase, and then dump the fatigue through a taper, and they compete. But I think the research we have on strength training is very, very specific to the immediate strength gains, not long-term strength development. So it's very difficult to make firm conclusions about periodization and how do you integrate hypertrophy training with strength. But I think you can make strong conceptual arguments for how to do it. And the way I like to do it, given that there's this much stronger volume hypertrophy relationship and there's a much earlier plateau between volume and strength, is that we think about, all right, if the phase of training I'm far from competition, is a dedicated hypertrophy block, like you said, Dave, that means I need to be ensuring that I'm setting the stage for good future performance. So the question becomes, how do I monitor my strength in a way that enables me to see if it is decaying? Because I would argue that if I'm going to spend 3 months out of a 6-month build up to a competition, I don't actually want to see my 1RMs going down substantially while I'm doing hypertrophy, right? So I think of this as kind of like an analogy of, you got your foods, you're a chef, you got the back burners that you're just keeping warm, and then, okay, I need to get something done right now, I move it to the front. So if we break this down into, say, 3 phases, we have the hypertrophy block, then we have the development block, and then we have the peaking block. In the hypertrophy block, I want to figure out what is the minimum effective dose for the big 3 that enables me to both monitor their progress in strength and also retain a certain level of strength. And I found that's actually extremely low. So it might be something like they're squatting and deadlifting once per week and they're benching twice. We work up to 1 or 2 singles at something like a 7 to 8 RPE. So a 2 to 3 RIR. Then after that, it's all non-specific work. Not all, but a much higher proportion of it. They may go close grip on the bench for their back off work. They may hop on dumbbells or a chest press machine. We might do safety bar squats after their squat. They might do deadlifts and RDLs. We might even do back extensions. It'll look very much like a bodybuilding program targeted towards the muscles that are probably determinants of powerlifting performance. And then we're just doing maintenance singles on the main lifts. And those tell me two things. I have an estimated 1RM. If I've taught them, like we talked about earlier, how to gauge proximity to failure, bar speed, and especially if we have velocity, I can get an estimated 1RM immediately from that single at a 7 RPE. It's easy. It doesn't take much time. It tells me about their status. And it also tells me about, are we doing enough to maintain strength? Because my KPI, what I want to see when I got someone in a hypertrophy block is I don't want to see estimated 1RM going down. If it goes up, great, but that's extra credit in my mind. The goal is I want to actually see increases in size. I want to see their performance going up on all their accessory work. There's specific accessory work, but not hyper specific, right? And that block will last probably longer in proportion to most of the other stuff they're doing until we have a meet on the schedule. And then we got like this maybe 8-week period where we're doing the development, right? And this is where we're doing a big shift in emphasis towards the main lifts, but we're doing a little more volume on them. So now we go from, let's say, doing squats and deadlifts once per week and bench twice, to now we might be building up towards going from, say, 2 squats, 3 benches, 1 deadlift to 3 squats, 4 benches, 2 deadlifts. And if I'm working with a lightweight person with no prior injuries, they're young, we're talking like a 52 kilo woman, we might get up to benching every day and squatting on all these except for 1 and deadlifting 3 times. You know, I've worked with several very high level lightweight female lifters and they can take a lot, you know? And now and that takes a lot of time. So you end up being logistically constrained. So then you shift, what is the maintenance emphasis? So while I don't want to see my 1RM decay during the hypertrophy block, I don't want to actually be losing muscle mass during my development block. And you're probably not going to. I've got all of these singles and then we're doing back off sets with the main lift again or a close variation. So it might be a single on bench and then we go to machine chest press or dumbbells during the hypertrophy block. During the development block, it might be 2 singles on bench and then 3x5 on bench with, you know, some variation or just bench, you know, just raw. And then for squats, we might have been doing squats followed by safety bar, and now it'll be squats followed by squats, just reps. Yeah. So, and then obviously, because that's all taking a certain amount of time, I probably got to cut the volume of the accessory bodybuilding work down by into 2/3 to 1/3 of what it was previously. And then finally, we move into the peaking phase where we retain that same frequency of the main lifts, and the RPE probably went up from like, say, 7 to 8 to maybe like 7.5 to 8.5. And now we're doing a lot of singles in the 8 to 8.5 to 9.5 range, multiple days, less back off work, but all specific. And this is a model. Obviously, it's going to be individualized. And then actually cutting out the accessory work progressively as part of the taper. And then cutting out the back off work as part of the taper. And then going kind of that taper that I described where you individualize it to when they peak, their size and what you've observed with them. So they've got this maybe, 12-week, 8-week, 3-week block. So they got this, 23-week prep. And then you bring them in there. So you have this disproportionate amount of time where they're doing a lot of non-specific bodybuilding work. That's kind of the model that I've evolved towards and that I find works really well for raw powerlifters especially, and especially drug-free raw powerlifters. I think you have to be very intentional about building muscle mass. It doesn't just happen as a kind of a consequence of training and letting other things happen that enhanced powerlifters do, right? Mm-hmm. I say that as someone who is not trained enhanced powerlifters and who has largely worked with raw powerlifters. So I understand that model probably wouldn't fit in an equipped situation and it might not be the best balance for things. But when we're talking about, hey, I want to get into coaching raw lifters in the IPF, that is kind of the model I teach. I don't think it's a better model, but it meets all of those constraints. And it's also very easy to teach. Like, because I do mentoring with other coaches. Like, okay, we start with a minimum of frequency of singles. And they don't have to be singles, but I find that's easy. And then there's a low frequency at a moderate intensity, and then that increases. The frequency goes up, the load goes up, and it progressively goes up. And that enables you to keep your finger on the pulse of what your strength is. So at this entire 23-week block, I've got estimated 1RMs. And that is what I use as one of my first auto-regulation tools. If that's not going in the right direction, something needs to change.
Yeah.
It could be nutrition, it could be anything. But if I'm not seeing my 1RM go up, and I also have certain goals for each block, like I just want to see it maintained or maybe go up, great. Then the hypertrophy block is successful if your accessory work performance improves. Now I want to see your accessory performance maintain, and I want to see your estimated 1RM go up. But I know you're going to be more fatigued because we're doing a lot of volume. And now I want to see a pretty precipitous rise in your 1RM, and then a plateau, and then an increase when I deload. And I can't know whether it all worked until you competed, but then we go back to then, okay, let's review that whole 23-week peaking block and see what we're going to do differently for, say, nationals after regionals.
Now, in the third phase, where you chop in the hypertrophy training more so, not completely out. In the fourth phase, when you chop that down, are you increasing the effort of, let's say they were doing 6 hypertrophy sets across 2 or 3 movements. And with those in those earlier phases, they're applying maximum force to each one of those reps. When you chop that down and it's a smaller part, do you reduce the tempo? Do you do something to reduce, to still keep the demand, for the hypertrophy high, but purposely incorporate ways to have lower load to be able to have the same result?
I do that on more of a auto-regulated basis if they're starting to get joint issues. The beauty of hypertrophy is it's such a forgiving adaptation. Like you can reduce tempo substantially, and so long as you get to the point where you're no longer voluntarily slowing it, you're involuntarily slowing the rep, you've gotten to that same place of motor unit recruitment. And so I will do things like that if needed, but most of the time, the bodybuilding work stays relatively static. The rep ranges are generally between 8 to 15 or 6 to 20. The RIRs are starting around a 2 and they're working towards failure. It's exercise dependent. I'm not going to do the same thing I would on a bicep curls at leg press, if they even have a bicep curl. It's a bad example.
Yeah.
It's not bodybuilding. It's powerlifting hypertrophy specific work is the best way to put it, right? And I do believe that growing is a lot harder than maintaining muscle mass. So I think just doing a lot of singles, doubles, and triples, and especially just for a 4-week block, the amount of muscle mass that they're going to lose during that phase is going to be pretty minimal. So if we're talking just 1 to 2 sets per exercise and they're at 2 or 1 RIR and I haven't really changed much, I think that's definitely sufficient in most cases to see minimal decay in muscle size. And even if there was some decay in muscle size, I mean, we're talking some, if it's substantial, then you would see a drop on the weight on the bar. It's something that is probably not actual contractile tissue, and recoverable quite quickly. There are other interacting effects here too, is most of the time, because I don't work with super heavies, is they get to that final phase and they're also cutting weight, So you have to think about, okay, at what point are we actually trying to lose, water weight and gut tissue mass, or when are we trying to actually lose fat tissue? So that sometimes I try to make it so that during the peaking phase, they're not actually in a deficit anymore, that we've done the fat loss earlier, and then we can actually bring them up into a calorie maintenance. So they can kind of come into the show at maintenance and just do a gut cut and have an easy time making weight. A lot of powerlifters have a big mismatch between their nutritional support for their training and their training. Like they go, oh shit, I'm 6 weeks out and I got to drop 6 kilos. So they're in the most hardest portion, the highest volume and the highest intensity peak of the whole program. And they go, let me just put myself in a calorie deficit. I try to get that done earlier and more progressively so that as they're in the last, say, month of the prep, they're eating at maintenance. So there's even more support there for hopefully holding on to size. They're going on a low volume program on their accessories. They're doing, still some doubles and triples on squats for back off work, but not a lot, mostly singles on the main lifts. And then 1 or 2 sets per muscle group per week of the hypertrophy work, reasonably close to failure, but not with super demanding exercises. And that, I think, coupled with the fact that ideally we're not dieting and it's only a, 3-4 week period, I'm not too concerned about there being a drop off in size. But absolutely, if there are more often, what I run into and why I would use tempo for that specific question is that you get to that point and there are some niggles that are bothering the person. There's an elbow issue, there's something. So I'm very flexible with exercise selection, and I'm very flexible with things like tempo. Like I don't put accessories on a pedestal. I do really emphasize, because this is a problem with the modern generation of raw powerlifters, is I did my accessory work. And I'm like, no. Like, I'm coming from a bodybuilding background where there is no accessory. Like, my calf raises are important, Like, I try to instill that mentality. sometimes when I work with powerlifters, they are surprised that I want them to send me a video of them doing a cable row. And they're like, why is that important? And I'm like, because you're probably sandbagging it.
Mm-hmm.
Like I've had elite level powerlifters who can deadlift over 800 pounds send me a report where they were doing RDLs with 315 and they told me it was a 7 RIR at 12 reps. And I'm like, no fucking way. Like you can definitely RDL 600 pounds, you know? Should we right now? Let's have a conversation about that, because your perception of the importance of accessory work, how hard it should be, and what load is actually going to be useful. Like, listen, if you're going to do a 30% of 1RM RDL for 8 reps, just get on the treadmill. If you're going to do cardio, like do something more efficient. Like that is, I don't think that's doing much for you, right? So you see that a lot. And if you are experienced across different strength sports and movements and bodybuilding, you know what someone's like accessory movements load should be based upon their 1RM numbers. And if they're doing dumbbell shoulder presses with 60 pounds and they're a 500 pound bench presser, you're like, dude, like, come on, you know?
Yeah, unless they're moving it really slow.
Really slow.
Very slow. Yeah. Now, to take some of what we know in the powerlifting realm, which would be the skill acquisition of the lifts. Now we jump over to bodybuilding and we kind of get back into that effective reps and sets and just volume, right? Then what I wonder is when there's a lot of people that will say, you know, there's way too many reps, you know, across the mesocycle, whatever it is, and there's multiple different movements. There's skill acquisition associated with each one of those movements too. And if their target is to have 6 effective reps over 2 sets, and to do that, they're only going to do sets of 7, you know, 2 sets of 7, and they don't have build-up sets. I mean, they have a warm-up set, but it becomes very minimal from what I see with what people are extracting from the data. It's like, well, these are what matter, so I'm going to warm up and I'm going to get right to that. Then I wonder, outside of like machine shit, like, well, there's still skill acquisition associated with this movement. As I know that relates to the main lifts, because if you break down, your techniques breaks down, you're fucked, right?
Yeah.
But when we get over to the muscle hypertrophy, I don't know if that matters. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Like, does it really matter if the fucking curl wasn't executed as effective as it actually has to be? And that aspect that's being lost, is it, my gut tells me there's still something being kind of lost with that, because you should be able to master that skill.
Yeah.
If there is such a thing as a mind muscle connection, which may not be, you know, who knows? But what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I think there's the kind of long-term career development perspective on this, which is, I do actually like the power building model, because when you look at complex to simple skill acquisition transfer, it's far better than the other way. There's a great study by Rossi and colleagues where they gave untrained individuals programs where they did 100% squatting, 50% leg press squat, or 100% leg pressing. And then they looked at their leg press, squat, and counter movement jump max. So how high could you jump is the max for the counter movement jump, and then just their 1RM on the leg press and the squat. And quite unsurprisingly, if you think about it, what you saw was a 1RM on squat that scaled to how much squatting they did. So the group that did 100% squatting got stronger than the group that did 50-50, and got stronger than the group that all did leg pressing. For leg press, no differences between groups. Very similar absolute numbers. So the leg press did not transfer to the squat, but the squat transferred to the leg press. And then the counter movement jump, which is a close variant of a squat, an unloaded squat where you allow yourself to leave the ground, also scaled to squatting performance. You jumped the highest in the group that did the most squats. So with that kind of preamble, to me, it makes sense to teach some of the cardinal movement patterns to bodybuilders that are a little more complex at the start of their career. So getting them to where they are comfortable going to failure or close to it on key presses, like a horizontal press, a vertical press, a horizontal pull, a vertical pull, a hinge pattern, and a squat. I think those are really valuable. It doesn't have to be a barbell back squat or a barbell bench press, but I want it to be free weight. And I think those skills transfer to almost everything else in the gym, or most of the movements that we use. Like there are other things like pullovers and, you know, some of the funky stuff that you might see now, like a single arm lat pull down. So I think from a career development, you don't want someone jumping right into kind of like that TikTok biomechanics wave of bodybuilding movement that is available now as a novice. You know, like someone who really doesn't even know how to feel the target muscle, which I think is a version of mind-muscle connection that's a real thing. When you're doing movements where you can accomplish the task by recruiting different muscle groups to different degrees, I think mind-muscle connection is a thing. It's not that you can manipulate it at high loads, but that you can perform it with different strategies. So you can do a more hip or knee dominant leg press or squat, and you can definitely do like the back is probably the best example. You can do back exercises in many ways to accomplish the same thing because it's so complex back there. So I think you do want to establish some cardinal movement pattern proficiency. Bodybuilders need to be a jack of all trades and a master of the key movements, not a master of none, in my opinion, because you want to be able to leverage the forgiving nature of bodybuilding, of going, oh, my elbow's a little funky today. I can train that muscle group some other way. You know, I can't leg press today because of maybe the load through my knee, but I can piece that together with some single leg extensions at high reps and then some like glute kickbacks or something, you know, like I can get what I need to get, even though I'm limited. And powerlifters don't have that luxury. You know, you can only stay away from the core 3 lifts for so long without seeing a decay or stagnation, which is, you know, if you get old as a powerlifter, you realize where that threshold is and like, how much am I just holding the line? Or, okay, what do I actually need to do to improve my SBD? Because damn it, like, this isn't working. I'm too banged up. But bodybuilding is so much more forgiving. And there's that old meme of like, I started as an Olympic weightlifter in my 20s, and I became a powerlifter when I got too immobile and slow. And then I got into bodybuilding when I could barely even move, you know? I may resemble that. But I think, so from a career perspective, you absolutely want movement competency and key lifts from the start so that then you can branch out and be proficient earlier in specific variations that you might use for physique weaknesses. As far as in the short term, I think if you have a lifter who is very competent in these movements, they have more ability to do auto-regulated exercise selection, which is, I think, important because exercises are vehicles for stimulus for bodybuilders. And if you understand the biomechanics, you can manipulate them in your favor. But you can't just be like, oh, a lat pull down is the same thing as a cable row is the same thing as a T-bar row. Like these do different things to some degree. And then the degree to which form breakdown matters is also specific to the movement. So if your form is breaking down on a single arm lat pull down, you may be targeting different muscles, and that's how you're getting there. And the reason why most of the time that form breaks down or form changes in the course of a set is for one of two reasons. Either the lifter is just thinking about moving it to point A to point B and they're trying to hit a PR, they're just thinking about the logbook. This sometimes happens with powerlifters on their accessory movements. There's no objective standard. I don't need to hit depth, right? I'm just trying to more weight, more load, good, powerlifter, yay. Or it is an ego decision. You know, I want to say that I'm moved this weight or I'm this strong, which happens to the best of us. Or potentially it is just movement strategy. This is just what your body does. It is not necessarily like set a priori as a program to get the most out of the bicep. I am doing this, right? And unless I have trained myself to keep tight constraints on what is a bicep curl, it is moving point A to point B. Like when you climb a tree, you don't think, let me flex my hip, let me extend my knee, let me go into shoulder flexion while I'm extending my elbow. You don't, that's why external cues work better than internal cues for performance. Your body is developing a movement strategy on the fly to accomplish a task. And bodybuilders use tasks to stimulate muscles. So they have to retrain themselves a bit as a human to think about, okay, let me make sure these task constraints ensure that the muscle is still being trained. So one example where a bicep curl probably would matter if it started to alter is if they're in an incline curl. So you're doing an incline curl, you're leaning back, the biceps are a biarticular muscle. So they cross the shoulder and the elbow. And we have good data to show that the biceps, not necessarily the brachialis that are monoarticular, they don't cross the shoulder, do grow more from, say, a incline curl versus a preacher curl. Now, when you get tired on a bicep curl, it is only natural to do some shoulder flexion on that biarticular muscle, right? You get your deltoid involved, I can still do the movement. Now, when you're doing that though, you're taking the biceps from a more elongated, more stretched position and higher tension that probably is why it's stimulating more hypertrophy, and you're putting it in a shortened position. So you're cheating yourself not only out of some gains, a small amount, but you're also cheating to get the rep. But you can do cheating in a way that helps you on different movements. So for example, if you're doing lat pull downs, and you do partials at the end of the set. You know, you can't touch your chin anymore. And now you're doing, you're just letting it decay into nothing. Old school Eric, I'd be like, what is this person doing? Like, the hardest part's down here. That's what matters, at least by feel. But that's also where your muscle is shortened. All the muscles are shortened at the bottom position. And the resistance curve of most back work is such that it's hard in the shortened position and easy in the lengthened position. So lengthened partials, as they've come to be called colloquially, probably have a larger potential benefit on exercises with that resistance profile, where it's super, super easy when the muscle is long and very hard when it's short. So the limiting factor is the shortened range of motion strength. And if you are a super strict kind of scientific, perfect form lifter, you're like, oh, well, that was a 10 RPE, because in the next rep on my cable row, I couldn't touch my abdomen. You're reaching task failure by those strict task constraints, but the back and the biceps are probably nowhere near muscle fatigue. So was that set as effective? And is that why we see these anecdotes that, oh yeah, you need way more back volume than you do chest volume? Or is it just shitty exercises don't provide as much stimulus, so you make up for it by doing more sets?
I see. The way I see that manifest is said lifter may have incline bicep curl for a set of 12, right? And by 8, you can see, as long as they keep that technique, they're probably not going to be able to do 9 or 10. But then they'll start swinging it. Yep. Right. And then it's like, dude, you were there.
Yeah.
Like, you were one rep away from being where you were supposed to be. Yep. You know, the whole goal of the set was there, but then you just cheated it to be able to get the 12, but still never got there.
Yeah. You got some front raises in.
Yeah. But you still,
but you didn't put your bicep to failure.
Yeah. Exactly. And they get locked into what that, especially for hypertrophy work, they'll get locked into that rep.
Yes.
And I get it as a strength athlete, because, that's what's programmed. But here it's like, just let it die.
Yes.
And get it over with, sooner, because you're just prolonging, what that can be. And where when we get into the progressive overload, that's where things get weird to me with the bodybuilding, because I come through that generation that you can change the movement, every time that you go in, as long as it's, elbows out, elbows in, as long as you're targeting what you want to be able to target. Right. But the progressive overload load model is you have to be able to increase weight, every single time you do that. And from the bodybuilding side, I'm like, do you? And even with that, with the increase in the weight, do you have to, like, 2.5, 5 pounds every single week?
Yeah.
Can you just, like, use the same weight for a month and become better at it, then add 10 pounds? And you see what I'm saying?
Yes, I do, exactly.
People get locked into this, and then it's like, you don't have to always do that movement. What if you go to a gym and you don't have that machine?
Yeah.
You got to use something else. So there's still, how's progressive overload? Because progressive overload can happen through different modalities outside of just load, and the load doesn't have to be every single training session.
Yeah, and it's not going to be.
Yeah.
Or like, at a certain point in your career, if you could go up 5 pounds on any lift every time you trained, like, at what point are you lifting Jupiter, right?
Exactly.
You lift for 30 years, like, okay, so that means I'm putting 260 pounds on a lift per year. So in 3 years now, I've added 700 plus pounds on the lift? I don't think so, So progressive overload, I think, is often misunderstood because of the term progressive and because of the load being there. Really, all we need to think about is overload. And that sort of takes care of itself, because as we adapt, unfortunately, the goalpost for overload adapts with us, right? So the way I like to think of this is that just because you can do it doesn't mean that it is required to produce overload. If we take someone for the first time they ever do a squat, and let's say the most they've ever squatted is their body weight for 2, and that was the time they got off the toilet, they dropped their keys, and they sat back down and stood up again. That's not their 2 rep max, right? They can probably do maybe 20 if they're in okay activity of daily living kind of shape. We might be able to put, let's say 100 pounds external load on their back and do a 1RM squat. Do they need to do 5 reps with 75 pounds, to adapt? No, they're adapted to 2 reps of their body weight off the toilet. So we could quite literally, in this person who has only done 2 reps of body weight squats ever, put the bar on their back, even though they can squat 100 pounds as a novice, and tell them to do 1 set of 5 every other day. They would get stronger for a while, but eventually, even though we didn't change the load, they would plateau. And now maybe their squat, say, is 150. Now we could add 25s. This is not the best program. This is not optimal.
No, I get where you're going.
But they will adapt to something far less than what we traditionally think is appropriate for a program. So I think we tend to think about progressive overload as being, I must progress the load from what I did last time, but it's much better thought about in reverse. If progression is occurring, if overload is occurring, I should see progress. So if overload is successful, I will be able to see measurable progress over an appropriate time course for my training age, right? So this is where you can embed that conceptual model with psychology for the purposes of bodybuilding. And the way I do it is, instead of giving them a specific rep target, I use an auto-regulated double progression model. So double progression is kind of what you were saying earlier. Once I can hit a certain rep target, then I'm allowed to increase load and I start building back up from the bottom. But psychologically, that gets you locked into, I got to do 8 reps. And once I can get all sets of 8, then I got to do 9. They start cheating. They don't actually progress because they're not actually overloading their bicep. Or if they do progress, it's this sloppy, super cheaty curl, right? And we're getting growth in other places that we're not attempting. But if I tell them, hey, your rep range on this movement is 8 to 15, and the target RIR on your first set is a 2, and I don't want you to go below a 1 RIR. Now, they're allowed to do 8 reps, 9 reps, 10 reps, 15 reps. They can even decide to go heavy on one day or light on the next. And once they are able to add reps, they do so. So it is basically saying that I'm not a wizard. I can't predict how quickly you're going to make progress on this bicep curl, but it's a bicep curl. And we're going to keep it as a bicep curl. And then when you can get 7 reps, and when you can get 8 reps, and when you can get 9 reps, and you can stick to the RIR, fantastic. And then once you've gotten to the top end range, so the point at which it becomes more like normal double progression is if I went, okay, it's 8 to 15, and the first set's a 2 RIR. If you selected a load that you thought would be 15, and you got 16, and it was a 2 RIR, hey, awesome. Now I know I can probably lift more. So it lets you progress at the rate that you can relative to the stimulus that's in the program. And likewise, if you never get to 15, and I just ran an 8-week block with you, that tells me this is not a sufficient stimulus, or something else needs to be changed, nutrition, sleep, what have you. So this is a monitoring tool, it's a psychological tool, and it matches what we actually understand about hypertrophy, and it prevents people from doing exactly what you described. And it also gets people out of the mindset of, I need to make weekly progress on something. And you can still try, but I think realistically what we're looking at here is also not just progress on that one lift, which is kind of a powerlifter mentality, but as a bodybuilder, you need to think about holistically in my program. I might have 3 upper body days, 2 lower body days, or something like that. And I've got, a total of 20 sets per muscle group, and I've got 10 exercises that spread across, or maybe that's too many, maybe 6, right, for a given muscle group. Do I need to see progress on all of them? Not necessarily. I think powerlifting is performance. It's very directed. It's measurable. You know faster when it is or isn't working well. Bodybuilding is much more like being a gardener or a farmer or baking something. You get the recipe as close to best as you can. You can kind of peek in there, but the stove it's a little opaque. Those lines are in the way. I need to stick a fork in it. Like, okay, it's still wet. We'll put it in there for some more time. Oh shit, I forgot the flour. You kind of have to set it and forget it and get whatever performance feedback you can along the way. But it's very challenging to directly measure hypertrophy in the field.
Hey guys, if you're enjoying what you're watching, make sure to take a moment to like, comment, and subscribe.
I can't bring in, I have things are changing. There are such things as portable ultrasounds now and stuff like that. But when I'm working with a client online, I can't bring them to the AUT lab and ultrasound their bicep and their quad and get ISAC kinanthropometry, like skin fold assessments or anything like that. So I'm looking at, in the off season, maybe a video of their physique every 3 months, and primarily their performance and then what they tell me. So if I'm seeing a clustering upwards of performance, and that is matching up with, I think, physique changes that are in the right direction, and when that doesn't happen, I've changed the variable and it started happening again, then I know I'm on the right track. But it is much more this kind of process of like, okay, I'm a farmer. I've got the seed, which is the progressive overload, and I need to get the right amount of sun, water, and the right soil composition. And I need to go back and check on it and see, okay, like with the weather and how it is now, is it the amount of growth I'm expecting? But powerlifting it's a sport, like, okay, what's my estimated 1RM? Things are trending or not trending in the right direction.
What are the misconceptions that you're seeing with the recent onslaught created from the bulking science that's kind of just recently come out?
Yeah, we did a really cool study that took forever because of COVID happening in the middle of it, which prevented us from collecting the amount of data we wanted or getting it done within the year we anticipated. It actually took like 3 years, where we took some pretty well-trained lifters, especially for the literature. Some of them had actually competed in bodybuilding. Some had competed in strength sport, both Olympic weightlifting and powerlifting. But overall, there was a mixture of experiences, and we put them into 3 separate groups. We at AUT were blinded to which group they were in because it was a nutrition protocol. And I had an off-site RD, Steve Taylor, who works with 3D Muscle Journey. He's our RD. Contracted him for the study. And I said, I basically want you to do one-on-one coaching with these people. And they're going to get put into one of 3 groups, a 5% surplus, estimated based upon rates of weight gain, a 15% surplus, or we're trying to keep them at maintenance, so roughly weight stable. And then they're going to come with us, and we're going to train them 3 times a week on a kind of modified version of like that development block. It's mostly hypertrophy work. We have like a circuit, but after doing squat and bench in kind of a periodic strength block. So we're looking at 1RM strength changes, and then ultrasound derived muscle thickness changes in the biceps, triceps, and quad. And then because we didn't get the sample size we wanted, we said, you know what, let's not compare the groups. Let's just look at the relationships among all 17 of our participants with surplus size, because we got all their nutrition tracked, and probably the best surrogate for that, since this is human data, we don't know how well they followed their diet. Yeah. It's not a metabolic ward, was weight gain. So we looked at the relationship between weight gain and some of 8 skin fold measurements, which is a very high precision measurement, even though people don't like skin folds. If you're actually just looking at the millimeters, it's technically has lower or a higher degree of precision and better reliability than even DEXA. But it is not telling you about total fat mass. It's telling you about subcutaneous fat, which is arguably what we care about as bodybuilders anyway. So we're looking at the relationship between sum of 8 skin folds by a experienced anthropometrist, 1RM squat, bench, and then muscle thickness on bicep, tricep, and quad. And the strongest relationship we had by far was that the more weight someone gained, the more their skin folds went up. And then we didn't see a relationship with weight gain and 1RM squat, 1RM bench, tricep, or quadricep muscle thickness. And here's the thing. Everyone was on a 3-day per week program, moderate volume, pretty good, well-written program, but it was not a auto-regulated, individualized program. We didn't poll them to say, how much are you normally doing in your traditional training? The demand for what we would have had to do to make inferences from that, if we individualized everyone's program, would be, we would need like 100 people, because now we're looking at multiple factors. Okay, everyone is on different volumes, different exercises, all this different stuff. We're not looking at the independent effect of the interaction between the training that they did and changes in muscle size and strength and fat mass, as well as whether they are in a surplus or not. So we kept it to that, and unsurprisingly, in my opinion, based upon their training status and the fact that they were probably training less than most of them would have done normally, we couldn't force feed gains on the whole. And basically trying to force feed gains, and the more weight someone gained, was mostly related to fat mass gains. And the one glimmer of hope we had for bulking was that we did see a weak relationship between bicep muscle thickness increases and weight gain, but it was very weak. So like the strength of evidence was maybe 1/10 of that of the body fat gain. And we were, okay, so why did we see uniquely the biceps grow? And then I looked at, okay, well, we talked earlier about what are the determinants of programming variables for hypertrophy. It's proximity to failure and volume, right? So they did squat and bench, and that was most of their volume for quads and triceps. They did do some shoulder pressing as well, so the triceps got a little more volume, but they did a lat pull down and a bicep curl, or a row or lat pull down and bicep curl on all 3 days they trained for 3 sets. So the total amount of volume that they got on the biceps was, I think actually they had some days it was 4 sets. I think they got 18 to 20 sets, if I recall.
They're getting it out of the row too.
Exactly.
Yeah.
If you're looking at like total sets, counting it fractional sets to be a little different. All of those sets for the hypertrophy work as well were a failure. So the biceps uniquely got the most training to failure and the most total sets. And they're the only one that seemed to grow a little bit in proportion to the size of the surplus and the amount of weight gained. So this tells me what? If you have the capacity to grow, you can match that capacity with the size of the surplus and you can benefit from it. But if you are trying to just eat big to get big and your training has not changed, if you're not a novice anymore and trying to go back to the well of bulking because that's what worked when you were in your 20s, I mean, you can't force muscle to grow. The training is the stimulus, and I always like to say this, that nutrition is permissive to growth. It's not a driver of growth. So that is shown pretty collectively when you look across other studies too. Like we got the classic study by Rosnick back in the early 2000s where they took young, untrained university-age males and they gave them a 2,000 calorie weight gainer on top of their normal nutrition or had them eat their habitual diet. And it didn't matter whether that weight gainer was entirely maltodextrin, just straight carbs, like here's sugar on top of your diet, or whey protein and carbs. Both of those groups gained almost a pound a week for 8 weeks, while this group only gained like 2 or 3 pounds and lost a little bit of body fat. So they were actually in a net deficit and they still grew muscle. That's how powerful the stimulus is when you're a complete novice. And then these completely untrained people, they gained, 2 to 3 times as much lean mass and total body weight compared to that group because you met the demand of their training. They had the capacity to grow almost a pound a week for their first 8 weeks of ever training in these young university-age males with a weight gainer. So that's a very different scenario than someone who's been training for 8 years, not 8 weeks, right? Mm-hmm. Now you have to think about, all right, what's a reasonable amount of muscle mass that I can gain in 8 weeks? A pound, if things go perfectly, So then you think about, all right, well, if I'm only going to be growing what I predict is about a pound in the next couple months,
or in advance you're talking about?
Maybe, like best case scenario, right? Yeah. So maybe over the course of an awesome year, you're 5 pounds, right? So that means what kind of surplus are we talking about here? 50 calories that I actually need? And then it's a pragmatic thing. Like, okay, can you track a 50 calorie surplus? And our data would also indicate perhaps not, because we had these 3 distinct groups. We had a 5% surplus, which is actually a very small surplus, a 15% surplus, which is a little more normal, and then maintenance. But when we actually looked at the between group differences, the amount of weight gained was quite similar between 15 and 5%. Meaning that even though they were told to stay in this certain weight range and we did auto-regulate their nutrition based upon weight gain, people were good at being directionally in a surplus, but whether they were good at being in a 100 calorie surplus or a 300 calorie surplus, that came out in the wash. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What are you working on now?
A lot. So I have the privilege of doing a lot of student-oriented, student-directed research. That's what I love about AUT is PhD students come out, and if they've got a cool research idea and we have the funding and the equipment and the ability to do it, we'll do it. So Kedrick Kwan, he is one of the most well-known nutritionists in powerlifting right now. He works with probably 30% of the world champions that exist right now and most of like the Sheffield cast. I'm very proud to call him one of my PhD students. He's graduating in a couple months. So he's done some really cool work that we're working on publishing right now that looking at different timing of using the sauna, how much people lose from a gut cut, and doing some really cool comparisons between the combat sport literature, another weight class based sport, and then powerlifting, and what things are similar and what can we take from that about preserving performance better through a more intelligent weight cut. And then also, what do we need to do in terms of total amount cut? When do we do it? What methods are better than others? Is there an additional effect of being dehydrated and also having heat exposure stress? When do you recover from that? And then, okay, if you are going to do that, should that affect your squat opener? Maybe you should drop your opener, but then make bigger jumps if you had to cut a lot of weight. So really practical, cool questions. That's one example of neat research that's coming out from Kedrick Kwan. We also just got some internal funding to look at metabolic stress. So that has been theorized as something that might influence hypertrophy. But the question is, well, how do we measure metabolic stress in an effective way to see if it even is? So we have a MOXIE unit, which is just a muscle oxygenation unit. So it uses a certain wavelength of light to see the actual levels of deoxygenated hemoglobin and total hemoglobin that's in muscle. So you can overlay it on top of a muscle during training. And then we want to know if that has a relationship between the type of training that's performed, say the volume or the proximity to failure, as well as the perception of a pump in the individual. So, bodybuilders have talked about pumps forever. We can maybe subjectively scale it on like 1 to 10 or 1 to 7 or 1 to 5 or something like that. And then we can also look at the objective change in muscle size acutely with ultrasound. So we can look at actual acute muscle swelling in ultrasound. We can look at the perceived pump, and then we can look at actual changes in the best proxy we have for metabolic stress, which is, markers of deoxygenated hemoglobin, which tells you more about anaerobic glycolysis using the energy system, which creates anaerobic stress. So, or metabolic stress rather. So are those things even related? How good are people gauging? Like, if I think I got a massive pump, did my pec actually grow? Or am I actually sensing just the burn? Or maybe just like the amount of contraction strength I had? Does that change in different rep ranges or different exercises? So we're going to be doing some cool looks at some of what we consider proxies of hypertrophy. And that's going to be done in partnership with, I have a PhD student who's a competitive bodybuilder from Japan. His name is Takahiro Itagaki. So I'm doing powerlifting research, bodybuilding research. And I've also got another student, Andrew King, and he has done work looking specifically at pre-workout fueling with carbohydrate and the influence on resistance training performance. Like, what do you need to do in the gym to where that actually matters versus when it doesn't? And he's already published one of his studies where we did like multiple sets at 80% of 1RM on squat, shoulder press, and bench. It's like kind of a full body strength session, and it didn't seem to matter whether they got in the like carbohydrate or a comparative, like more protein fat dominant fuel source or placebo. So now we're going to go, okay, well, let's push the limit. Let's do higher reps and let's do a whole lot of volume for the legs. Let's create the kind of still realistic, but kind of end extreme high volume puke kind of leg day. Does that matter? Now we're tapping into far more what we think would be glycogen dependent training and see if it matters. And if it doesn't, then we have to go, well, why not? So that's going to be a kind of cool end stage part of his project. And we just got the capacity to look at specific subcellular depots of glycogen. So kind of the old school, not old school. I said the research we used to have on glycogen, we could only look at total muscle glycogen depletion. Like, oh, okay, resistance training depletes 20 to 40%. When you can look at specific portions of the muscle now, there's cool research that's come out of Scandinavia. We're even doing like powerlifting training. Yeah, total muscle glycogen depletion might have only been 30%. But the specific type 2 fiber glycogen depot near the contractile element was almost completely depleted in a majority of muscle fibers. So yeah, you can still produce force, but maybe you don't have that top end strength. And it makes me wonder, like, oh, this kind of neural fatigue we're experiencing, is it actually selective glycogen depletion in fast twitch muscle fibers that you're only going to pick up if you have to do something that really demands those to come to the party and significantly? So, I mean, that could be many different components to it, but that's cool because this last study he's doing, not only is he doing high rep leg work, but he's also going to be looking at the actual subcellular glycogen depletion in specific fiber.
Will he then go back and look at the first one?
I wish we could, but we would have to have gotten biopsies from those participants then and during the study. And we didn't have that biopsy capacity back a couple of years ago when we did it. So I think, as researchers always say, more research is needed.
Yeah, exactly. How do you determine which articles to put in the Mass Journal? So I've been a subscriber of that since like the second month.
Which, by the way, when we found out, we saw your subscription come through, we had a whole holy shit that we got to pinch ourselves moment. Like Tate just subscribed to Mass. We have arrived. And that was something that was really cool. So we're so honored.
No, thank you. I love it.
That's so cool to hear that. So what we do is we have a journal sweep, and we've had either some of Dr. Zerdos's or mine currently PhD students do the journal sweep. Historically, it was some of Dr. Zerdos's PhD students. And then once I got my own PhD students, we actually pay them to do it. And it's cool because when you're doing your PhD, you are embedded in the research. And the students that we have both at FAU and at AUT are often, at least a large portion of them, or our students specifically, Dr. Z's and myself, focused on the stuff we review in Mass. So, strength, hypertrophy, nutrition. So it's a great opportunity for them to earn some income during their PhD because it's, you don't have much time, and it's without necessarily diverting them in a totally different direction. So like Kedrick, for example, and my former student now, Dr. Colby Sousa, they do the journal sweep. and they go through all the articles, and they basically, with some guidance from us, like, hey, here's what fits the scope of what we're doing. These are the journals we want you to look through. They create a spreadsheet that typically has a couple hundred articles, just the title and the link. And then each one of us, Lauren, myself, Trex, and Mike, each month when it comes up, we go through the journal sweep and we think what is the most relevant to our subscribers and in each one of our wheelhouses. So I'm not going to lie. I typically go into the spreadsheet for the month. Like, let's say we're going to release an April issue and it's the February list because we're writing it in March. And I'll do Control F and I will type in body B to see if bodybuilders or bodybuilding comes up. And I'll type in physique with a Q to see if physique sport or physique comes up. And then I'll type in powerlift to see if powerlifting or powerlifters comes up, or weightlift. So I do that first, and I kind of like prioritize, like, okay, is there anything that's directly relevant to strength or physique sport? Because, it's my special interest. It's what I love, and it's what got me into it. So that is, and it's kind of like, mass isn't only for strength athletes and physique sport athletes, but I would say I'm probably holding down the fort for that crew the most. So that's kind of what my corner of mass is almost always about or relevant to, or even non-competitive, aspects of it. So that's what I go through. And then I also look through, okay, let's look at all the articles that are related to hypertrophy, fat loss. And then I tend to also like to do a bit of kind of meta thinking about holistic stuff, because I think sometimes if you get too locked into, as we've talked about, just thinking about what's going to optimize muscle growth in a very controlled condition or fat loss or strength, you miss elements of, okay, what is the behavioral mindset that drives athletes to stay in the game? What are the determinants of, making a good coach? Because if coaching was just about knowing the science, that means that the best coaches from 30 years ago are trash coaches, right? Because we had less science 30 years ago. And even the science we thought we had was more wrong. So science is a portion of being a good practitioner, but I wouldn't even say it's the major portion. It is the art of coaching, which is developing relationships and being able to monitor and understand things and communicate with people and get the most out of them. Kind of that whole thing we talked about where I use the navigator analogy. So I try to also incorporate some things like that. I will write about athlete burnout, perceptions of, ability to auto-regulate. I think that is really important too. So I definitely look at applications of coaching psychology or athlete mentality that could go into things. I think that's something, as an athlete myself and as a coach, I never drift too far away from that, even though I'd like to get into the weeds as far as you can.
Well, what was the inspiration for it in the first place?
That's a good question. So Greg Nuckols reached out to me in 2017. And he said, hey, I think we can do a really, really good research review that is targeted specifically towards strength athletes. And, I'm just finishing up my master's. I want to make sure that I have people with me who are also have more research experience, because Greg is brilliant. And he did a master's because he knew that one weak point of his knowledge was the actual being in the lab and conducting research. And he did that and he got some exposure to it. But he reached out to me because I was finishing my PhD. He reached out, I want to say, in early 2017. I graduated at the end of 2017. So I had now done, a master's and a PhD worth of work. And during a PhD, you also just do like a bunch of other stuff in the lab. I probably participated in 30 studies and then been a assistant on another 10 on top of the stuff that was part of my work. And he reached out to me and I said, that's a really cool idea. And we talked about it. And he was like, do you think there's anyone else we could partner with so we can, get this out more? And I said, well, my mentor, Dr. Zerdos, after I finished my PhD, he might be interested in this. So the three of us had some talks. We thought it could work. We brainstormed a lot of different acronyms. We stayed away from applications in strength sport because that is ass.
Yeah.
As an acronym.
Yeah.
And we eventually came to monthly applications in strength sport, MASS, which is a perfect name. And we went real strong for many years. And then Greg got really involved with Macro Factor. He found that the monthly writing just wasn't his thing. And he stepped away, I want to say just after COVID. And slightly before that, we brought on Eric Trexler, who he did his PhD at the same place where Greg did his master's. They met, and Trex is brilliant. He is now at Duke, doing broad ranging, human physiology and psychology work looking at metabolism. And he has become one of the preeminent experts in, I would say, metabolism as well as meta-analysis. And then we brought on Lauren Clenzo-Semple, now Dr. Lauren Clenzo-Semple, who has a very impressive track record. She did her PhD with Stu Phillips, probably the most well-cited protein researcher. And she has also done work with Brad Schoenfeld. She's done work with Andy Galpin, and she's also been a personal trainer in the industry. And she is, I would say, one of the most qualified experts on nutrition and protein metabolism as it applies to women's health and performance. And so we brought her on a couple of years ago, and now we're growing strong. And believe it or not, Dave, we have the Sports Nutrition Association conference coming up this weekend in Austin, where I'm flying out after we talk. This will actually be the first time the four of us have all met each other in person.
Oh, really?
At the same time. So I've met Eric in person and I've met Mike in person, but I've only talked to Lauren online for this whole time. And I believe Lauren has met Eric in person, but has not met Mike. And Mike and Eric, I don't think have met either. So it'll be the first time we're all together in person. And we've been doing this for 8 years now, believe it or not.
No, I loved it when it came out because the situation that I would be in, I subscribed to multiple journals, right? Scientific journals. I don't want to name a lot of them, but I'm not astute at reading the research, right? And so I would stumble across something in one of these things and be like, this is amazing. It validates my bias. This is great, right? And then I would send it off to somebody and they come back and say, no, this is actually trash because what you didn't look at was X, Y, and the things that you need to look at if you're a researcher to be able to know if this study was actually worth the shit or not. And then I would see that and be like, what's the point?
It's frustrating.
Because the summaries just sucked, right? Because a lot of times the summaries weren't what the actual thing said. Right. And I did slowly develop the ability to find that. But when I saw this, I'm like, oh, shit, I don't have to do that.
Nice.
Somebody else has already done that. Now I can just cherry pick which one of these things I'm going to read.
Yeah.
Because there's a lot in there. And I biasly read probably the things that you're marking to put in there.
Yeah, man.
But the other things are nice to have in there because they'll spark interest.
Yeah.
Like I didn't think about that, especially if it's the supplementation or some of the psychology things that will go in there.
Yeah.
It's like, I didn't think about that. And then I love it. I mean, like I said, I've been with it since it started. So
David, I'm so honored to hear that because not only that you subscribe, but that you continue to find value in it. And that the reason why you stay subscribed to it is the same gap in the market that we saw, not just the market, but also the need for it in the community. Because I noticed very distinctly that the way I read research totally changed as I got into my later career. So when I first started reading research, going all the way back, I talked earlier, 2008, 2009, I'm finding studies and I'm reading it. I would read the introduction, read a little bit of the methods, get intimidated, read kind of some of the results, not know what the stats meant, not understand what some of the methods were. And then I would read the discussion and basically trust the author's interpretation. And then I got a little more exposure to in-lab work, and I knew the statistical test that I used for my stuff. And now I could read the whole method section, and I could mostly understand the results, but I couldn't really critically analyze them. And then I would trust most of the discussion. So early in my career, I read the introduction to the discussion, and now I almost don't read the introduction to discussion at all. It's like, what did you do and what did you find? And then what do I think about it? And that's such an interesting change because now I see it in our students. So I work with master's students all the way through PhD, and you can see which gaps in their knowledge they have. And I also think about practitioners. So our goal with mass is, you'll see sometimes we also try to help people with their own science interpretation. Like if someone wants to, Trex wrote a whole guide on research interpretation and statistics, because I think the biggest issue we have in the modern era, and this has probably been true for the last 10 years, is not that there's a lack of information. I mean, you and I both came up in eras where, like, if I found a study on powerlifting, strength, bodybuilding, hypertrophy, it was like gold. It's like, oh my God, it's not a cycling study. And it's practically written. It's in the Journal of Strength Conditioning Research. Hold on, there's a Journal of Strength Conditioning Research? It was, everything I found was just like finding an old tablet from the Bible that was never discovered. Like, oh my God, And now there is so much research that people are almost becoming anti-science because of overwhelm, or feeling like there is flip-flopping, or man, I thought we knew this and now they say this, or I can't follow this, or so it's this. Now we're trying to help people deal with the fire hose effect. It's not like you can't find research on protein. You can find 10 studies on protein that are being promoted by 10 different influencers, and half of them are interpreting it in a different way than the other.
Yes, there's biased extrapolation, right? So anything that I see, this is what you guys do a good job of, because this is exactly how I use it now. Anything I see trending around, Instagram Reels or whatever it's going to be. And if it's really trending, if it's hot, I know within a month or two, it's going to be in there. It's like, okay, cool. I'll wait.
Yep.
I just leave this to the experts to be able to kind of summarize what all this is, because to dig down the bias extrapolations that get posted, and I get why they do it.
Absolutely.
It's positioning, it's marketing. I get that. It can be confusing.
Mm-hmm.
I still think it's a net positive, but I think it can be confusing because people will bounce around, or they'll leverage things into their own bias.
Yes.
To be able to support that. And I get that too. We understand all this. We understand how it all works. But a lot of the younger people come in and don't.
They don't. And they can't even necessarily discern between when it is intentionally done knowingly by the person, like it's disinformation or misinformation, or just plain old being wrong, which is fine too. And I do agree it is a net positive as well. I pinch myself every day when I think about people are on TikTok and Instagram debating the findings of a study about protein's intake effect on gaining strength and hypertrophy.
It's crazy, isn't it?
This is a good time to be. No matter how frustrated I get when someone, like I caught myself losing my mind a little bit. There was this thing that went around and still going around, that the eccentric doesn't build muscle, and just as this useless portion of the action that causes fatigue. And I posted like 10 meta-analyses, umbrella reviews, and systematic reviews, and only 10 because I ran out of posting space on Instagram. I'm like, this is not a thing. Let's just kill this baby in the cradle. I'm sorry. It absolutely is not the case. And I understand that we have this kind of science-based model, but we have all this data. And if you don't check your model against what we found, then how are you ever going to update your beliefs? And I found myself, by the end of the day, I was angry. And I was like, hold on. I'm responding to social media because people are talking about eccentric training and they're misinterpreting the data. Is this really that bad? Yeah.
Well, the next trend I'm waiting for, because we've had the eccentric data, we've had the lengthened partials, we've had concentric. I'm waiting for the peak contraction phase to come through, because right now that doesn't matter at all.
Yeah.
Right. You don't even have to do it, so it's, I guess it's up to you to be able to, lean in to be able to study what actually is happening there, if anything, because it's right now it's the child that's being left out of the equation.
And everything, as you know, you have been in the industry even longer than me, and I've been, doing the thing for more than 20 years now. Everything comes back around, and you can predict things that will probably come around based upon what's hot now. I literally remember joking with some of my colleagues, like, you know what, vegan's really big right now. I bet you something like a meat only diet is going to come out in a few years. People are going to be like carnivores. And we went,
yeah.
And here we are.
Yeah.
So
I wonder that with training though, because if we think back, the HIIT style training, like high intensity, low volume, then the high volume, moderate intensity, that pendulum would swing back and forth frequently, like every 3 or 4 years, boom, here comes the next one. And I always found it strange, because the people that were having great success with HIIT style training, which all these people get pissed if I say dog crap is HIIT, it's all high intensity, low volume. Yeah. People in that camp would then switch to the higher volume, then this is the greatest thing in the world. And I'm like, maybe it was just the change, just throwing some random shit out there, and kind of vice versa. And over the past 5-6 years, I've seen the bubbling, of like that HIIT model trying to come back. Yeah. And it never does. I think there's just so much data out there from the training side that really neither one of those is going to pop like it ever did before, because there's too much pushback when it comes.
I think you're right. Certain things that are too dogmatic to survive in the data-driven era, they can't come back, at least in full force, from the same way.
They try.
They do try. Like I was shocked. Like a bunch of these people who are 18, 19, 20 love Mike Mentzer. And I'm like,
yeah, but see, that only lasted like a couple weeks.
It's holding on a little bit there.
Because I was thinking, here it comes.
Yeah, it hasn't had the same total revival. But what I do like about the high intensity camp is it does remind us that it doesn't take quite as much as what is like optimal volume is a terrible return on investment. And the question is, well, okay, is it worth it to you? Like, I am a competitive professional natural bodybuilder who's trying to compete against these guys who are way better than me on the world stage this year, right? So am I doing more than I think I need to do to grow? You bet your damn ass I am. Am I training like I have a part-time job in the gym? Absolutely. Do I need to be doing that much? No, I don't need to be getting in a Speedo at all, but need is not the question, right? Yeah. And I think sometimes, trainers who come from the same background as you and I, people who are just really, really nerding out and interested in strength or size or this stuff, the information we seek out and the questions we ask are not the ones that are truly relevant to many of our clients if we work with the general population, especially. Knowing that 4 sets to failure produces 60% of the progress that you're ever going to make, even if you increase volume, that's incredibly useful to someone who's only going to train 2 hours a week.
No, it's huge. I mean, I'm not against it in any way because all these programs can be broken down into methods.
Yes.
Right. And if I'm time constrained, as I am a lot of the time, then that's kind of how I'm training because I know what my minimal effective dose would be.
Exactly.
And that's kind of right about where it would fall. Right. Now, if I have more time, I would enjoy to be able to do, more.
Yes.
Because of that. Would I elicit more gains? It's debatable, but sometimes it's just what you like to do.
100%.
Now if it's sporadic between one and the other, it's just bouncing around all over the place. That's probably a different conversation. Now it's just a random mess that I don't want to say won't serve at all, but won't serve as effectively.
I totally agree. I think, I'm not a huge fan of people getting dogmatic and having camps, but it does force the community who wants to move forward and find the silver lining of knowledge to consider, well, okay, when is that applied? Because I think we were in an era, and I think we're kind of getting out of it, of just, science is best. Now there's a lot of critique of science. There's even criticism of science. Some of that comes in society with COVID and things like that, which is not all bad. I think...
Isn't that science?
It should be, right? Exactly, right? We critique ourselves all the time. I think the only time there's an issue is if you don't realize you're at the peak of Mount Dunning or Mount Kruger and you're critiquing science, right? Like the death of the expert is also a thing. Like I've never been in a lab. I don't know how to read the methods or the results, but I feel right about this and I don't trust authority or just what you're saying, and you're just an elitist. And therefore, I'm going to interpret this research on my own. And I'm never going to tell someone they shouldn't try to read research or interpret research on their own. But I think you just need to be honest with yourself about what domain expertise do you have.
It's not as easy as people think it is.
And you just can't know some of these things unless you know them. Like, yeah, you've been in the gym 10 years. This study doesn't comport with your experiences. But do you actually understand what the study was done? Are the researchers morons and you actually know better? Or are you missing something? And you might not be missing something, but you should probably be open to the idea that perhaps you are. And then you should maybe check with some people you trust who have the same or similar in the trenches experience you do, but who also have some lab experience or know how to read. And I do acknowledge, man, there is an issue with, I'm not going to call it an ivory tower because it makes it sound like sports science has far more money or organization than it really does. But I would say there's an unfortunate gap between what should be an applied science that is directly disseminated to coaches and athletes and the people and them consuming it. If science in an applied field was done and communicated as effectively as possible, mass wouldn't need to exist. You know what I'm saying? Like, this is not theoretical physics. Like,
wouldn't that be all fields though?
Not all fields, because like, for example, theoretical physics, in my opinion, this is not something that is meant to teach, Joe Public, right? This is something for a applied physicist or an engineer to go, okay, how can I take this information and do something crazy at NASA? Or, if you want to understand neurosurgery, this is important for your GP to know so he can give you the right neurosurgeon, but even they're not going to need to fully understand it. But when we're talking about something like behavior change, nutrition, sports science, who is the end consumer? It shouldn't just be other researchers. It needs to be other researchers, but it also should be something that gets out to the public. And traditionally in science, that is not something that we've taught people. That's changing. There are now science communication courses and researchers are being encouraged, but there's an entire cottage industry, mass is part of it, that exists because scientists aren't that good at communicating or writing in a way, and the structure is not the scientist's fault. It's like the publishing company's structure, what is taught in university, what is a graduate school experience, what is valued, and what are the incentives. They aren't aligned, even though they should be, in an applied field that goes directly to the consumer with communicating the science as simply and effectively and concisely as possible. So I think it is especially important in the modern age with so much information out there to give more and more focus to science communication in these applied fields. And I consider myself not just a scientist, but also a science communicator. And I think it's really important. And it's different. If we think about the science communicators that are most well known, they kind of, that's like the Carl Sagan of my generation, and then the Neil deGrasse Tyson of the more modern generation, and other people like that. They're cool, because they're teaching the kind of the wonder of science, and they're keeping people engaged and curious about the world and understanding where they live and their place in the world. But it shouldn't just be like one or two famous people for those really kind of out there fields. You need that in essentially every field. And if you're a scientist in an applied field, I think to some degree, unless you're doing really mechanistic research, like you're looking at animal models or petri dishes, but if you're like me, where you are studying athletes in an applied setting to influence what coaches and athletes are going to do, I think it is to some degree your duty to be at least attempting some science communication as well. So I hope we're part of that change, and I hope we're leading the charge. And it just gives me it warms the cookies in my heart, Dave, that you subscribe and that you feel like you're getting that benefit, because you're exactly our target audience, right?
How can people get a hold of you?
Hey, since we just talked a lot about mass, check out massresearchreview.com. We have a lot of free content. We have a weekly podcast every week. That's Iron Culture presented by Mass. And then we, merge that with office hours. Also, if you're interested in the bodybuilding side of things, if you want to work with one of our awesome coaches who it's my job to make sure they're informed, that is 3dmusclejourney.com. And then if you're interested in just following me and all the cool stuff I do outside of those worlds, like coming on the Table Talk podcast, I share that type of stuff on my Instagram at Helms3DMJ.
All right. Well, I want to thank you for coming out. I have a gift for you here.
Oh, thank you so much.
And there's a shirt, there's some element packs, there's a training log, and inside the log, there's a coin that I give to people that I feel embody the reason why I started this company, which was to live, learn, and pass on, which you do amazingly.
Thank you so much.
So it's been great following your career.
I'm honored to hear that so much. Thank you.
And you're doing great things. So I want to thank you for coming out, and any final thoughts?
My final thoughts are that people like you are the reason why the industry is moving in the right direction. Like, you have paved the way. I think there are very few people who stay so obviously curious, passionate, but also are still a leader. And they don't let, their worries of what they don't know prevent them from being a confident leader in our space. So I honestly feel incredibly privileged to be here. And you're an excellent model for people to stay curious, stay growing. And I think if progressive overload only applies to what you do in the gym, you're missing out on so much of what the iron has to give you. And I think you're an excellent ambassador for that. So thank you, Dave.
Thank you. And we're done.
Let's do it.
All content you see on this channel and at elitefts.com is created by, take a guess, Elite FTS. If you want to help support the content, head over to elitefts.com and pick up literally anything that you need to be able to get more jacked and strong.